Welcome to Stars. Whispers, find a comfortable place, let your body settle. Allow the weight of the day to soften and dissolve. This is a space for you to rest, to breathe, to let your mind grow quiet or gently wander. We're about to begin a long, slow journey. A journey to a place of stone and sky, of gold and ancient faith. This is Aksum, Africa's lost empire. For the next hours, there is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do, only a story unfolding at the pace of clouds. A story of an empire that rose to greatness and slipped into legend. Let your breathing deepen, let the outside world fade. Origins of a Highland power. The highlands of northern Ethiopia are a world shaped by stone and sky. A vast, elevated tableland, fractured by deep river gorges and crowned by flat-topped mountains, it is a landscape that commands both awe and isolation. This is the Tigrayan Plateau, a cradle of civilization suspended between the earth and the heavens. To stand here is to stand at the roof of Africa, where the air is thin, the horizons are endless, and the very geography seems to whisper of ancient secrets. It is not a gentle land. The soil is often thin, spread over a bony skeleton of rock. The rains are capricious, the sun relentless. Yet, it was here, in this austere and demanding realm, that one of the ancient world's most remarkable empires took root. A kingdom built on stone and trade, and a legend written in gold and covenant. This is the story of Aksum, but before Aksum, there was the land itself, a geography that did not merely host a kingdom, but actively forged it. The story begins not with a king or a conquest, but with a mountain range, a climate shift, and the slow, patient work of human adaptation. This is a tale where geography is not just a setting, it is the primary character, the architect of destiny. The Tigrayan highlands are part of the larger Ethiopian massif, a colossal bulge in the continent's eastern horn created by volcanic uplifts millions of years ago. Subsequent millennia of erosion carved this plateau into a complex maze of ambers, those flat-topped mountains with sheer cliffs and deep, winding valleys. These natural fortresses provided unparalleled security. An invading army, weary from the coastal lowlands, would face a grueling ascent into thinner air, only to be confronted by a labyrinth of defensible positions. The highlands offered a natural citadel, a fact not lost on the early inhabitants. But this security came with a cost. The isolation was profound. Communication with other nascent centers of civilization in the Nile Valley, or across the Red Sea, was a formidable undertaking, a journey of weeks through difficult terrain. This duality of protected isolation and challenging connection would become the central tension and the ultimate strength of the Highland culture. They were in the world, yet apart from it, forced to develop self-reliance while yearning for the goods and ideas of distant markets. The climate of the plateau played an equally formative role. During the period around 1000 BCE, the region was significantly wetter than it is today. The hills were verdant, covered with forests of cedar and fig, and teeming with wildlife. Rivers ran full, and the fertile soils, washed down from the hillsides, collected in the valleys. This pluvial period created an agricultural bounty. The indigenous peoples, cultivating native grains like teff and finger millet, and herding cattle, sheep and goats, found they could produce a surplus. Surplus is the engine of civilization. It frees people from the constant struggle for food, allowing for specialization, for the emergence of craftspeople, traders, priests and rulers. The abundant rainfall made the highlands not just a fortress, but a fertile granary. However, the climate was already beginning its long, slow shift towards aridity. The people of the highlands became masters of water conservation, developing sophisticated terracing and irrigation systems to capture every precious drop of rainfall, techniques that would underpin the agricultural wealth of Aksum. They learned to live in balance with a capricious environment, their survival and future prosperity hinging on their ingenuity and respect for the land. The location of the highlands was their final geographic gift. They stood at the crossroads of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. To the east, beyond the brutal Danakil Depression, lay the Red Sea. This narrow strip of water was not a barrier, but a highway, one of the most important maritime trade routes of the ancient world, linking the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean. The Highlands, however, were not a coastal power. They were an inland hub, their ports, such as Adulis, established at a safe distance down on the coast. This was strategic genius. They controlled the trade from a position of unassailable strength. The luxury goods flowing from the interior of Africa, ivory, rhinoceros horn, gold, exotic animal skins, and, most crucially, live elephants, would be funneled through the Highland settlements. From the coast came goods from the Roman world, from India and from South Arabia, iron tools, fine textiles, glassware, wine, and olive oil. The Highlands became the vital link, the place where African wealth met global demand. The geography dictated the economy, secure the plateau, control the trade routes to the sea, and prosper. Thus, the stage was set by forces of geology and climate. A secure, defensible heartland, a fertile, if demanding, agricultural base, a strategic position astride continental and maritime trade networks. These were the raw materials of empire, but stone, soil, and location are passive. It takes human ambition, creativity, and organization to transform geographic potential into historical reality. The people who inhabited this landscape were not passive recipients of fortune. They were active shapers of their world. They looked out from their mountain fastnesses, saw the possibilities, and began to build. They terraced the hillsides, not as mere farmers, but as engineers sculpting a sustainable future. They charted the routes to the coast, not as simple guides, but as entrepreneurs envisioning a commercial network. They absorbed influences from across the water, not as imitators, but as synthesizers, creating something entirely new. The Highlands imposed a discipline, a toughness, a unique perspective. They fostered a culture that was deeply rooted in African soil yet irresistibly drawn to the wider world. This is the essential paradox of Aksum, an empire that was profoundly indigenous and confidently cosmopolitan, a powerhouse born in the clouds. From this formidable cradle, the first stirrings of complex society began to emerge, not yet an empire, but a promising fusion of cultures laying the groundwork for what was to come. Long before the name Aksum echoed across the Red Sea, the Highlands were not an empty stage. They were a vibrant theatre of cultural exchange, where African traditions met and melded with influences from across the water. This formative period is dominated by a shadowy, yet critically important, kingdom known as Domt, or Damat. Emerging around the 8th century BCE, Domt represents the crucial prelude to Aksum, the first major experiment in statecraft in the region. It is here that the story of Domt is, at its heart, a story of connection, a deliberate and sophisticated engagement with the sophisticated cultures of South Arabia. Across the Red Sea, in what is now Yemen, the kingdoms of Saba, Kataban, and others had flourished for centuries. They were masters of irrigation, building monumental dams like the Great Marib to turn desert into garden. They were adept traders, part of the incense route that supplied the ancient world with frankincense and myrrh. And they possessed a written script, a key technology of administration and power. For reasons that are still debated, trade, the search for new resources, or perhaps political expansion. Sabaeans and other South Arabians crossed the Red Sea and established settlements on the Eritrean coast and the adjacent highlands of Tigray. This was not a sudden invasion, but rather a sustained interaction, a cultural dialogue that lasted for centuries. The result was not a simple colonial outpost of South Arabia, but a unique hybrid culture, with Domt as its most prominent political expression. The evidence for this blending is etched in stone and baked into clay. At the site of Yeha, in present-day Tigray, stands a towering stone temple, one of the oldest and most impressive buildings in sub-Saharan Africa. Its construction technique, precise, dry stone masonry with carefully fitted blocks, is unmistakably South Arabian in style, reminiscent of the temples of Marib. The dedication inscriptions found here are in a South Arabian language, using the Sabaean script, and they invoke the South Arabian moon god, Al-Makar. To a casual observer, Yeha might seem a piece of South Arabia transplanted onto African soil, but that is only half the story. The very presence of such a monumental structure in the highlands speaks to a localized concentration of power and resources. The rulers who commissioned it were likely local elites who had adopted and adapted the trappings of South Arabian civilization to enhance their own prestige and authority. They were using a foreign language of power to speak to a local context. Beyond the monumental architecture, the blending is seen in the everyday and the spiritual. Pottery styles show a fascinating fusion. Traditional African shapes and decorative patterns begin to incorporate South Arabian forms and techniques. Agricultural practices saw innovation, with the possible introduction of new crops or irrigation methods from across the sea. Most importantly, the encounter with South Arabia provided a catalyst for social and political complexity. The idea of kingship, supported by a written script for record-keeping and monumental architecture for royal display, likely accelerated the process of state formation in the highlands. Dom was not a passive recipient, it was an active participant in a trans-Red Sea cultural sphere. The Highland people took what they needed: the technology of writing, the techniques of monumental construction, the symbols of divine kingship, and began to weave them into the fabric of their own society. Yet, for all its apparent sophistication, the kingdom of Dont appears to have been relatively short-lived, or, at least, its centralized power fragmented. By the 4th or 5th century BCE, the explicit South Arabian influence begins to wane. The great temple at Yeha fell into disuse. But the cultural synthesis it represented did not disappear. It went underground, percolating through the highland communities. The key technologies and ideas remained: the knowledge of stoneworking, the concept of a centralized polity, and, most enduringly, the script. The South Arabian alphabet was gradually transformed, its characters evolving to suit a different language, becoming the distinct Ge'ez script that would become the soul of Aksumite culture. Dont did not fail, it incubated. It was a necessary first draft, a proving ground for the fusion of ideas. When the center of gravity shifted, when the next powerful kingdom arose, it did so on a foundation that was already uniquely Highland, a foundation that remembered both its African roots and its Arabian connections. The stage was now clear, the cultural ingredients mixed. All that was needed was a spark, a unifying force to ignite the rise of a true empire. That spark would come from a small, unassuming town that would give its name to an era, Aksum. The origins of Aksum are shrouded in both myth and earth. Unlike the grand temple at Yeha, Aksum's beginnings were humble, a settlement perched on a plain surrounded by hills, with no obvious geographic advantage over its neighbors. Its rise seems almost improbable, which is why its founding story is so compelling. The myth, preserved in the later Ethiopian national epic, the Kebra Nagast, tells of a union between the Queen of Sheba Makeda and the Israelite King Solomon. From their union, the story goes, came a son, Menelik. This is where legend and destiny intertwine, for Menelik is said to have brought a sacred charge to these highlands, the Ark of the Covenant. Thus was established a divine covenant and a Solomonic lineage for its kings. This powerful narrative, compiled centuries after Aksum's peak, provided a legendary legitimacy to the Ethiopian monarchy, linking it directly to biblical royalty and divine favor. While historians dismiss the literal truth of the tale, it is a profound cultural artifact. It speaks to Aksum's desire to place itself at the center of a world story, to claim a heritage of wisdom, wealth, and divine chosenness. It reflects the empire's later deep engagement with the Judaic and Christian worlds, retrojecting a religious identity onto its origins. The myth of the Ark is not a history of beginnings, but a theology of destiny. The story later generations would tell and believe about where their power originated. Archaeology tells a quieter but no less dramatic story. The earliest layers at Aksum reveal a modest agrarian community dating back to at least the 1st century BCE. What set it apart was not its size, but its position. It lay at the nexus of important trade routes connecting the interior to the coast. It also sat in a relatively wide and fertile plain, allowing for agricultural expansion. The initial growth was likely organic, a gradual accumulation of wealth and influence through shrewd control of local exchange. Then, in the 1st century CE, something transformative happened. A distinctively Aksumite material culture emerges with startling rapidity. A new, fine pottery style appears, different from both earlier local wares and South Arabian imports. Most tellingly, a unique sense of identity crystallizes. This was not a slow evolution, it was a conscious self-creation. Aksum declared itself. The catalyst for this sudden flowering was almost certainly the dramatic shift in international trade. The Roman Empire's conquest of Egypt and its voracious appetite for luxury goods, particularly ivory, changed the economic landscape of the Red Sea. The older South Arabian kingdoms began to decline, creating a power vacuum. Aksum, perfectly positioned and politically agile, stepped in. It bypassed the old intermediaries and began to deal directly with the Roman world. The wealth that flowed from this trade was staggering. It funded public works, expanded the settlement, and, crucially, financed a professional army. With this new military might, the early Aksumite kings began a process of consolidation and expansion, bringing the surrounding highland territories under their control, either through conquest or alliance. They were unifying the Tigrayan plateau, creating the secure heartland their geography demanded. The founding of Aksum, therefore, is a story of convergence. It was the convergence of geographic opportunity, a fertile plain on the trade routes. It was the convergence of economic windfall, the Roman demand for African goods. And it was the convergence of ambitious leadership, elites who used newfound wealth to build a state apparatus, an army, and a unique identity. They did not inherit a throne from Solomon, they built a kingdom from commerce and clay. They took the fragmented legacy of Dompt, combined it with purely indigenous traditions of governance, and applied it to the new realities of a Mediterranean-dominated world economy. The humble settlement transformed into a royal capital, not because of a mythical lineage, but because of strategic genius and historical timing. From this potent mix of myth and mercantilism, the Aksumite state was born, ready to craft the tools it would need to endure. The most important of these tools would not be a weapon or a ship, but a system of signs, a script that would capture their language and forge their soul. Civilizations are remembered by their monuments, but they are understood through their words. For Aksum, the development of the Ge'ez script was not merely a technological achievement, it was the very foundation of a unique, enduring identity. It was the act of taking a borrowed tool and reshaping it so completely that it became an original voice, the medium through which the Highland Kingdom would speak to its people, to its gods, and to posterity. This transformation of script is the clearest symbol of Aksum's journey from a cultural hybrid to a self-defined imperial power. Language, written language, became the bedrock of administration, religion, and culture, setting Aksum apart from its African neighbors and aligning it with the great literate civilizations of the ancient world. The journey of the script begins with the South Arabian consonantal alphabet, brought across the Red Sea during the time of Dompt. This was a script designed for a Semitic language of a different branch. The early inscriptions at Yeha and elsewhere are pure South Arabian, used by a likely elite who may have spoken that language as a prestige tongue. But as South Arabian political influence faded, the need to write the local language, a Semitic tongue evolving into what we now call Ge'ez, became paramount. Slowly, almost organically, the script began to change. The angular shapes of the South Arabian letters were softened, curved, and simplified. More significantly, the very nature of the script was revolutionized. The South Arabian system, like its Proto-Sinitic ancestors, represented only consonants. Vowels were implied, left for the reader to infer from context. This was unsuitable for the precise needs of a growing state for record-keeping, royal proclamation, and later, sacred text. Thus, the Aksumites performed a remarkable linguistic innovation. They took the consonantal symbols and began to modify them in systematic ways to indicate accompanying vowels. A slight alteration in the shape of a letter, a tiny stroke, a change in orientation, would tell the reader whether the consonant was followed by an sa, 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 e, or o sound. This created a true syllabary, where each symbol represents a consonant-vowel combination. It made Ge'ez one of the most precise and readable scripts of the ancient world. This was no mere adaptation, it was a reinvention. It declared that the people of the Highlands had their own tongue, their own sounds, and they would now have a writing system perfectly tailored to capture it. The script became uniquely theirs, an intellectual declaration of independence. The implications of this development were profound. First and foremost, it enabled efficient bureaucracy. Royal edicts could be promulgated uniformly across the kingdom. Tax records, trade inventories, and land deeds could be kept with new accuracy, allowing for the complex administration of a growing empire. The famous Monumentum Adulitanum, a later inscription detailing the conquests of an Aksumite king, is a prime example of script in the service of power. A permanent public record of royal achievement meant to awe subjects and intimidate rivals. Writing solidified the authority of the state, making it tangible and permanent. Secondly, the Ge'ez script became the vessel for a distinctive religious and cultural consciousness. Before Christianity, Aksumite religion was a blend of indigenous deities with South Arabian and perhaps Greco-Roman influences. Inscriptions on stone altars and votive thrones, dedicated to gods like Astar, Marim, and Beher, were written in Ge'ez. This sacred use anchored the script in the spiritual life of the people. Later, when Christianity was adopted in the 4th century, the script found its ultimate purpose. The translation of the Bible and other liturgical texts into Ge'ez was a monumental project that preserved the language long after it ceased to be a spoken vernacular. Ge'ez became the Latin of Ethiopia, the sacred language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, a living thread connecting the modern nation to its Aksumite past. The script ensured cultural continuity over millennia, a feat few African civilizations can match. Finally, the possession of a written language placed Aksum in a specific conversation with the wider world. To the Romans, Persians, and Byzantines, a kingdom with a written language, a coinage, and monumental architecture was a civilized peer, not a barbarian periphery. Aksum's inscriptions, like the multilingual ones of King Ezana, show a kingdom confident in its own voice, but also engaging with the international community. The Ge'ez script was thus both an inward-looking tool for unity and an outward-facing badge of sophistication. It was the crucible in which a diverse collection of Highland communities was forged into the Aksumite people. With this powerful tool of identity in hand, the stage was set for the individuals who would wield it, the early kings who would transform a regional center into a legendary empire. A kingdom is defined by its people and its culture, but it is galvanized by its rulers. The early kings of Aksum are shadowy figures, their names and deeds often reconstructed from fragmentary inscriptions, coins, and later chronicles. Yet, from these fragments, we can discern the outlines of remarkable individuals who, across the first few centuries CE, executed a deliberate and stunning project. The establishment of Aksum not just as a local power, but as the dominant center of the Ethiopian highlands and a major player on the Red Sea. Their reigns were a masterclass in state building, combining military prowess, economic acumen, diplomatic savvy, and ideological innovation. They were the architects who took the raw materials of geography, the blended culture of Domt, the new script, and built an empire. The earliest kings we know by name, such as Zoskales, mentioned in the 1st century Greek trading manual The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, are already depicted as shrewd and sophisticated. The Periplus describes Zoskales as miserly in his ways and always striving for more, but otherwise upright and acquainted with Greek literature. This snapshot is priceless. It shows an Aksumite ruler personally engaged in the minutiae of trade, a king who is both a tough businessman and a Hellenized elite, familiar with the broader literary culture of the Mediterranean world. This duality is key. The Aksumite king was the chief merchant of the realm and a cosmopolitan monarch. His power was directly tied to his control of the ivory and other goods flowing from the interior. Under such rulers, Aksum's wealth grew, allowing for the next phase, territorial expansion and monumental display. The true transformation into an imperial power is credited to a line of kings whose names are recorded on their magnificent coinage and inscriptions: Endubis, Aphilas, Ausanas, and others. King Endubis, in the late 3rd century, took the revolutionary step of minting gold coins. This was a statement of breathtaking confidence. By issuing currency accepted in international trade, Aksum declared its economic sovereignty and parity with Rome and Persia. The coins were not crude imitations, they were works of art, featuring the king's portrait, often with distinctive Aksumite features and hairstyle, wearing a crown and sometimes a spear, and symbols like the disc and crescent representing the Then pagan faith. Inscriptions were in flawless Greek, the lingua franca of commerce, later transitioning to ge'ez. Coinage broadcast Aksum's power from Alexandria to India. It was monetary diplomacy. Concurrently, these kings embarked on military campaigns to secure their wealth. Inscriptions, like the Monumentum Adulitanum attributed to an anonymous king, boast of campaigns across the Red Sea into South Arabia, of subduing rebellious tribes in the interior, and of controlling the trade routes of the Nile Valley. The Aksumite army, funded by trade, became a formidable force. Expansion was not mindless conquest, it was strategic. Control the source of ivory in the south and west. Secure the ports on the coast. Project power across the sea to protect commercial interests and support allied factions in the fractious politics of South Arabia. The king was the supreme warlord, his legitimacy reinforced by victory. But the early Aksumite kings were more than warriors and merchants. They were high priests and living symbols of the state. They presided over a complex pagan religion, making offerings to the gods who guaranteed the kingdom's fertility and success. They began the construction of monumental architecture that would define Aksum's skyline, the great Stelae, or obelisks, which likely served as markers for royal tombs. The erection of these colossal stones, some weighing hundreds of tons, was an act of profound political and religious significance. It demonstrated control over massive labor, advanced engineering skills, and a commitment to creating a permanent, awe-inspiring royal necropolis. The king in life would be commemorated by a stone reaching for the heavens in death, linking the dynasty to the cosmic order. By the end of the 3rd century CE, through the cumulative efforts of these early rulers, Aksum was no longer just a regional center. It was the capital of a multi-ethnic empire that spanned the highlands, influenced the coast, and held territories across the Red Sea. It had a standardized economy based on its own coinage. It had a unique written language for administration and culture. It had a powerful military and a divine ideology of kingship. The foundational work was complete. The kingdom had been established on pillars of commerce, conquest, and creed. It stood poised at the brink of its golden age, a recognized equal in the courts of the ancient world. The cradle in the clouds had nurtured a power that would now demand the world's attention. Its gaze turned from securing its foundations to the ultimate expression of its confidence and piety, the carving of mountains into monuments, the raising of pillars of stone that would touch the sky. This brings us to the next chapter, to Pillars of Stone. Pillars of Stone, monuments, wealth, and the Stelae cult. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, where the air is thin and the sky feels within reach, stand silent sentinels of a forgotten empire. They are obelisks of stone, hewn from solid granite, some towering over 100 feet into the African sky. To the modern eye, they are enigmatic, stark, and beautiful. To the ancient world, they were a declaration. This is Aksum, a name that once resonated across the ancient globe, from the courts of Rome to the bazaars of India. A kingdom of immense wealth, sophisticated faith, and staggering ambition. Its heart was a capital city, a bustling metropolis of palaces and ordinary homes, of traders and priests, of farmers and kings. and at the very core of its identity, both physical and spiritual, were these pillars of stone, the Stelae. They are more than mere monuments. They are frozen chapters in a story of human endeavor. They speak a language of engineering, where moving a million-pound stone was an act of defiance against gravity itself. They whisper of religion, serving as bridges between the world of the living and the realm of the divine. They shout of wealth, funded by a mysterious commerce that drew gold and ivory from the continent's deepest interior. And they embody power, the absolute authority of a king who was both a political ruler and a sacred intermediary. But these towering stones are only half the story. They are the public face of Aksumite glory, the external proof of a covenant. For within the royal palace, guarded in a sacred chapel, was an object of immeasurable spiritual power, the Ark of the Covenant. The Stelae proclaimed the king's might to the world. The Ark was the divine source of that might, a secret so potent it was never seen. This is the tale of how an empire built its identity, quite literally, from the ground up. How it translated faith into granite, trade into tribute, and divine favor into a dynasty that would last for centuries. We are about to read these stone pages. We will delve into the tombs they guard, trace the roots of the caravans that paid for them, and unravel the complex society they supported. We begin at the beginning, with the most fundamental question: how on earth did they do it? The first and most obvious testament to Aksum's sophistication lies not in what the Stelae are, but in the sheer audacious fact that they exist at all. The largest of the Aksumite Stelae, known as the Great Stelae, lies where it fell, perhaps during erection, perhaps in an earthquake. It is a behemoth. 108 feet long, weighing an estimated 520 tons. To put that in perspective, it is heavier than a fully loaded Boeing 747. And it was carved, over 2,000 years ago, from a single piece of solid granite. The process began not in the Stelae field, but at a quarry located over 2 miles away, high on a hill called Gobedra. Here, the master craftsmen of Aksum confronted the mountain. They did not have iron tools hardened by modern metallurgy. Their chisels and wedges were of a softer metal. Their power was not hydraulic, but human. The quarrying technique was one of exquisite patience and understanding of the stone itself. Workers would first isolate a block of the desired size by carving deep, narrow trenches around it, using stone mauls and metal chisels. Then, the most delicate part began, separating this colossal block from the living rock beneath. This was likely achieved through a combination of meticulous undercutting and the strategic use of wooden wedges. These wedges, driven into natural fissures or carved slots, would be soaked with water. As the wood expanded, it created tremendous, controlled pressure, cracking the granite along a precise plane. It was a dance with fracture, a test of knowledge passed down through generations of stoneworkers. Once free, the monolith rested in its rocky cradle, a newborn giant. Then came the second, perhaps even more daunting challenge: transport. The journey from the quarry to the royal necropolis was a descent down a steep slope, across a valley, and up into the heart of the city. There were no wheels large or strong enough for such a load. The prevailing theory, supported by evidence from other ancient monolith-moving cultures and the geography itself, involves a system of ropes, rollers, and immense manpower. The stone would have been carefully lowered onto a sledge of massive timber. Beneath this sledge, a track of greased wooden rollers would be laid. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of men would pull on ropes made of twisted hide or fiber. Coordinated by drumbeats or chants, they would inch the sledge forward. As it moved, workers at the rear would frantically retrieve the rollers that emerged and run them to the front, creating a continuous, moving road. The slope downhill from Gobedra provided its own perilous assistance. Controlling the descent of 500 tons of granite would have been a feat of braking and guidance as impressive as the pulling itself. Crossing the valley floor required a prepared causeway, a road built specifically for this sacred cargo. Then came the final pull uphill to the Stelae field. The organization required was military in scale. The logistics of feeding, housing, and directing such a workforce speak of a centralized authority with profound command over human and material resources. This was not a project of a season, but of years for a single stone. One can imagine a laborer, his hands wrapped in hide against the bite of the ropes. The taste of dust, the creak of timber, the unified heave of 1,000 men, a deep groan that was part effort, part prayer. He would not see the stone raised. His son might. His grandson might witness the final ceremony. This was work that transcended a single lifetime. It was an act of faith, faith in the king, in the gods, and in the enduring meaning of the community's shared toil. And then, the final act of defiance, erection. The Stelae field is not flat, it is a hillside. Each obelisk was to be planted upright in a precisely dug pit, anchored by a massive foundation stone. For the great Stelae, the pit would have needed to be deep and wide, its walls shored up with timber. The process of raising it likely involved a combination of levers, ramps, and gravity. One method suggests building an earthen ramp beside the pit. The stone, on its sledge, would be painstakingly hauled up this ramp until it overhung the pit. Its base would then be guided into position, and by carefully removing material from the ramp or using lever systems, the stone's center of gravity would be shifted until it pivoted, sliding and settling into its permanent vertical home. The precision required is staggering. The base of each standing stela fits into a stone platform that includes a precise trough to receive it, and at the foot of each is a massive altar stone, often with drainage channels for libations. This is not crude heaving, this is calibrated engineering. The stelae themselves are intricately carved to resemble multi-story buildings. They have false doors at their base, windows, and horizontal beam ends, all meticulously reproduced in granite. The largest even have metal fittings, now long gone, that would have held decorative plaques, perhaps of bronze or gold. Every aspect, from quarry to erection to decoration, was a statement. It was Aksum shouting to its people, to its rivals, to the gods themselves, "Look what we can do." Our knowledge, our will, and our faith can make the very earth reach for the heavens. But to what end? Why commit such staggering resources? The answer lies not in the realm of engineering, but in the realm of spirit. These stones were not civic monuments, they were sacred vessels, the focal point of a profound cult of the dead that linked Earth to the cosmos. In the Aksumite worldview, death was not an end, but a transformation. The physical body entered a tomb, but the spirit embarked on a journey. The Stelae were the central apparatus in this spiritual technology. They functioned, first and foremost, as giant tombstones. But they were tombstones with a purpose far beyond mere commemoration. Each stela marked a subterranean burial chamber, a complex of rock-cut rooms and passages that housed the deceased. These were not simple graves, but homes for the afterlife, furnished with the goods a person of status would need. The stele above ground was the public marker, but it was also a conduit. Its form provides the key. The carved decoration, the false door, the windows, the layered floors, is an architectural representation of a palace or a great multi-story house. This was the eternal dwelling of the spirit, rendered in eternal stone. The false door at the base was of particular importance. In many ancient cultures, a false door in a tomb served as a metaphysical portal. It was a boundary between worlds, a place where the living could make offerings and the spirit could pass through to receive them. At Aksum, these false doors on the Stelae faced the rising sun, the ultimate symbol of rebirth and renewal. Offerings of food, drink, and incense would be made at the altar stone at the stele's foot. The spirit, residing in its stone palace, would emerge through this door to partake of the essence of the offerings, sustaining itself in the afterlife. The Stelae also reached skyward for a reason. They connected the subterranean tomb with the celestial realm. In Aksumite religion, which blended indigenous beliefs with influences from South Arabia and later Christianity, the sun, moon, and stars were deities or manifestations of divine power. A towering stone pillar, especially one aligned with astronomical phenomena, served as a ladder, a connection point. It anchored the deceased in the earth while providing a pathway for their spirit to ascend, or for divine blessings to descend. The largest stelae, therefore, were reserved for the most powerful individuals, the kings and the paramount elite. Their spiritual journey was of paramount importance to the entire kingdom, for the well-being of the state was directly tied to the favor the royal ancestors could secure from the gods. The cult of the Stelae was a state religion of ancestor veneration. Maintaining the tombs and making regular offerings was a sacred duty, likely performed by a dedicated priesthood. This practice ensured the continued protection and patronage of the founding lineages. The Stelae field was not a silent cemetery. It was an active, ritual landscape, humming with ceremony at dawn on festival days, smelling of incense and sacrificed animals, a place where the living and the dead maintained a vital, reciprocal relationship. The grandeur of the stone was a measure of the deceased's status, but also a measure of the obligation the living felt to ensure their passage and favor. To invest in a stelae was to invest in the eternal security of the soul and, by extension, the kingdom. But what did these tombs contain? What goods were deemed necessary for a king's eternity? For centuries, the secrets of the Aksumite royal tombs were just that, secret and tragically looted. That is, until archaeologists uncovered a burial that, though robbed, still told a breathtaking story of opulence. In the shadow of the Stelae field lies a structure known as the Tomb of the False Door. It is a monumental mausoleum, built above ground with massive stone blocks featuring, as its name suggests, an intricately carved false door on its exterior. When archaeologists entered this tomb in the early 20th century, they found a scene of devastation. Ancient looters had ransacked it, stripping it of its most precious contents. The sarcophagi were broken, the chambers disturbed. Yet, in the debris and in the very architecture of the place, the ghost of its original wealth remained, speaking volumes. The tomb was a multi-room complex, a veritable underground palace. The walls were once hung with textiles. The floors were littered with fragments of exquisite goods. Pieces of glass vessels from the Roman world, shards of intricate pottery, and fragments of gold leaf hinted at the treasures that were lost. But the looters missed some things, or deemed them worthless. They left behind the most important clue, hundreds of empty storage jars. These were not small vessels. They were large, ceramic amphorae, of a type used to transport wine and olive oil from the Mediterranean. Their presence in such quantity indicates a staggering funerary provision. We are not talking about a few bottles for the journey, we are talking about a cellar. This was a supply meant to last for eternity, to fuel endless afterlife feasts. Furthermore, the tomb's construction itself was a treasure. The precision of the stone masonry, the carving of the false door, the sheer labor required. All of this was a form of wealth deposited into the ground. From other, less thoroughly looted elite Aksumite graves, we can extrapolate what the Tomb of the False Door once held. Bodies would have been laid to rest on beds of bronze or ivory. They would have been adorned with personal jewelry, necklaces of gold and carnelian, earrings of intricate filigree, signet rings bearing their seals. Weapons inlaid with gold might have been placed beside them, ceremonial swords or daggers. There would have been items of daily use transformed into objects of art, bronze censers for incense, mirrors with handles of ivory, cosmetic kits. Imported luxuries would have abounded, glassware from Alexandria, fine red slip pottery from the Eastern Roman Empire, perhaps even silks from the East, long since decayed. The tomb was a capsule of a king's worldly power, a collection of the finest things his realm could obtain, both locally made and internationally traded. This obsessive, elaborate burial practice reveals a core Aksumite belief, status, and identity persisted beyond death. The king in the afterlife needed to be every bit as powerful, wealthy, and connected as the king in life. His tomb was his eternal court. The resources poured into it. The imported wine, the gold jewelry, the monumental housing were not seen as wasted. They were a necessary investment in maintaining the cosmic order, but such investment required a fortune of almost unimaginable scale. Where did this wealth come from? Aksum was not situated on gold mines or diamond fields. Its power was not born from mineral wealth, but from geographical genius. It sat at the crossroads of continents, and it mastered the art of the deal, controlling a trade so discreet, ancient historians could only describe it in whispers as the silent trade. Aksum's wealth was mercantile. Built on its position as the paramount gateway between the African interior and the maritime world of the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. The Romans called the region Regio Aromatica, the land of aromatics. But while incense from southern Arabia was part of the commerce, Aksum's true stock in trade was ivory. The vast hinterlands of the Sudan and the Ethiopian plateau were home to enormous herds of elephants. Aksumite hunters, or more likely their subjugated or trading partners, would procure the tusks. These raw, precious columns of dentine would then flow to the capital. From there, they were shipped from the port of Adulis down the Red Sea to Egypt, the Levant, and beyond. In the Roman Empire, ivory was a craze. It was used for everything from the veneer on elite furniture to the diptychs of consuls, from statuettes of gods to the handles of knives. Demand was insatiable. Aksum, controlling the supply, grew immensely rich on this trade. But ivory was just the beginning. There was also gold, mined in the lands south and west of the kingdom, perhaps in modern-day Sudan or even further afield. This gold fed into the same trade networks. Exotic animal hides were another luxury: leopard skins, rhinoceros horn, and live animals themselves, cheetahs for hunting, monkeys for amusement, even giraffes as living curiosities for foreign courts. The mechanism of this trade, particularly with the interior African tribes, fascinated classical writers like Herodotus and later Pliny. They described a system of silent trade, or dumb barter. According to these accounts, Aksumite merchants would travel to a designated border region. They would lay out their goods, salt, iron tools, cloth, glass beads, on a riverbank or clearing. Then they would retreat and signal with smoke or a drum. The local tribespeople would emerge, inspect the goods, and place beside them a quantity of gold or ivory they deemed fair. Then they too would retreat. The merchants would return. If they were satisfied, they would take the gold and leave their goods. If not, they would withdraw again, signaling the need for a better offer. This would continue until a deal was struck, all without the two parties ever meeting face to face. This story, while perhaps romanticized, captures an essential truth. Aksum acted as a middleman, a buffer, and a controller between two worlds that did not fully know or trust each other. It mastered the logistics of long-distance caravan travel, the diplomacy with intermediary tribes, and the maritime technology to ship goods across the Red Sea. The kingdom taxed this trade heavily. Customs duties at Adulis filled the royal coffers. This constant influx of treasure raw materials from Africa, finished luxuries from Rome and Byzantium, created a super-rich elite and a royal house of fabulous means. It was this wealth that paid for the armies, the palaces, the imported lifestyles, and, most enduringly, the staggering projects like the Stelae. The stone was local, but the ambition was funded by a global network. This economic engine required not just merchants, but a complex hierarchical society to manage it, protect it, and justify it. And at the apex of that society stood a figure who was more than a king. He was the living node where all these strands, commerce, religion, and monumental power converged. But this network, and the kingdom it fed, depended on a delicate balance. A balance between taking from the land and sustaining it. A balance not all empires managed to keep. Aksumite society was a pyramid, and at its pinnacle stood the Negusa Nagast, the King of Kings. His title itself implies a hierarchy of subordinate rulers, perhaps tribal chiefs or governors of conquered territories, all owing allegiance to him. His authority was absolute, but it was not based on brute force alone. It was sanctified. The king was the chief priest of the state religion, the primary intermediary between the people and the gods. His actions ensured rainfall, fertility, and military victory. His person was sacred. This sacral kingship is mirrored perfectly in the Stelae. The largest obelisks were his, or those of his immediate dynasty. By erecting such a monument, a king was doing several things simultaneously. He was fulfilling his sacred duty to honor his royal ancestors, thereby maintaining their celestial favor. He was demonstrating his command over the vast human and technical resources required, proving his administrative prowess. He was creating a permanent, undeniable marker of his reign in the landscape, a claim to immortality that would outlast any parchment or memory. And he was communicating directly with his people and rivals. For the ordinary Aksumite, seeing these stones rise was a spectacle of power. It was a tangible sign that their king was in right relation with the forces of the universe, that he could command the very bones of the earth. It fostered awe, loyalty, and a sense of shared identity as subjects of a kingdom capable of such wonders. The king's power permeated every level of society. Beneath him was a nobility, likely comprised of royal kin, military commanders, and the heads of great merchant houses. They would have had their own, smaller stelae and tombs, emulating the royal model on a modest scale. Then came a class of skilled artisans, the stone carvers, the metal workers, the potters, the shipbuilders, whose expertise made the grandeur possible. A vast administrative bureaucracy of scribes, using a unique script called Ge'ez, managed the treasury, the trade tariffs, and the logistics of state projects. There were soldiers to protect the caravan routes and expand the borders, and at the base, the majority of the population, farmers, herders, and laborers. They worked the terraced hillsides that fed the empire, and they provided the muscle for the monumental works. Their tribute in grain and their labor in the corvée system were the foundational taxes that, combined with trade wealth, built Aksum. It was a symbiotic, if unequal, contract. The people provided labor and sustenance, the king and the gods, through the rituals performed at the Stelae and elsewhere, provided protection, stability, and divine favor. The Stelae were the ultimate symbol of this covenant, stone contracts between the ruler, the ruled, and the heavens. Yet, for all their very public grandeur, they represented only one side of the coin of Aksumite sacred kingship. There was another source of the king's authority, one that was not displayed but hidden. A source so holy it was kept from public view, yet was the very wellspring of the kingdom's legitimacy. This brings us to the profound duality at the heart of Aksumite power. The Stelae were external, public, and declarative. They were meant to be seen, to awe, to dominate the skyline. They spoke of a king's earthly achievement and his pious devotion to the cult of the dead. But there was an internal, private, and intensely secret dimension to his rule. According to Ethiopian tradition, guarded for millennia, the ultimate symbol of God's covenant on earth, the Ark of the Covenant was brought to Aksum. Not a copy, but the very Ark described in the Bible, containing the tablets of the law given to Moses. It is said to have been brought by Menelik I, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, establishing the Solomonic lineage that Aksumite kings claimed as their own. Whether one accepts the tradition literally, or sees it as a powerful myth of divine election, its impact on Aksumite kingship is historical fact. The Ark, known as the Tablet, became the supreme palladium of the kingdom. But unlike the Stelae, it was never paraded. It was, and is to this day in Ethiopian Orthodoxy, kept in a sacred chapel, accessible only to a single guardian monk. Its power was not for display, it was for infusion. The king's authority thus flowed from two fonts. From the Stelae and the tombs of his ancestors, he derived the legitimacy of lineage and the demonstrated power to command the physical world. From the Ark, he derived a direct, unbroken link to the God of Israel, a divine mandate that set him and his nation apart as a chosen people. The public monuments proved he had the might to rule. The hidden Ark proved he had the right to rule. They were two sides of the same sacred kingship, the visible and the invisible, the monumental and the mystical. The wealth from trade built the Stelae. The Stelae manifested the king's power, but that power was ultimately sanctioned by the unseen Ark. This duality allowed Aksum to transition through one of the most significant religious transformations in its history. In the early 4th century under King Ezana, Aksum officially converted to Christianity. The Stelae cult, tied to the old pagan gods and ancestor worship, gradually ceased. No more giant obelisks were erected, but the underlying logic of power adapted. The king was still the sacred intermediary, now between his people and the Christian God. The focus of monumental architecture shifted to another form of stonework, the great rock-hewn churches of Lalibela. And the Ark remained, seamlessly integrated into the new faith as the ultimate symbol of God's enduring covenant with Ethiopia. The Stelae were left as silent witnesses to a previous covenant, their purpose fulfilled, but their message of ambition and achievement forever etched in granite. The pillars of Aksum, therefore, are far more than ancient curiosities. They are a multi-layered text. Their physical presence is a lesson in pre-industrial engineering, a testament to human ingenuity and collective effort. Their function reveals a complex spiritual universe where death was a journey, and the ancestors were active participants in the fate of the living. The tombs they guard whisper of a wealth drawn from the heart of Africa and the markets of the globe, a wealth that fueled an empire. Their hierarchy maps a society of stark divisions and unified purpose, culminating in the sacral king. And their silent, enduring presence, contrasted with the tradition of the hidden ark, illuminates the delicate balance Aksum struck between the visible demonstration of power and the secret source of its legitimacy. They tell the story of a civilization that looked inward to its spiritual needs and outward to its commercial opportunities, translating both into a language of stone that has endured for 2 millennia. They marked the rise of a kingdom that would become an empire that would forge a unique and enduring identity, one that saw itself as the guardian of a divine promise. The Stelae were the first audacious declaration of that destiny, but the story of Aksum does not end with these silent stones. As the kingdom consolidated its wealth and its unique identity, it began to project its power far beyond the highlands, minting coins that carried its cross and its king's profile to the wider world. Kingdom of such confidence does not look inward forever. Its gaze, fixed so long on eternity, now turned to the horizon. To the scent of the sea, the clink of gold, and the maps of conquerors. This brings us to the next chapter, to coins of the Conqueror. The Aksumite Empire at its zenith. Coins of the Conqueror, the Aksumite Empire at its zenith. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, under a sky of impossible blue, stand silent sentinels of a forgotten superpower. They are the Stelae of Aksum, slender needles of stone piercing the heavens, the tallest of them, a fallen giant, a monument of arrogance and engineering that once rivaled the pyramids. To stand in their shadow today is to stand in a field of mysteries. Who built them? How did they carve, transport, and erect these granite obelisks, some weighing hundreds of tons? And why? The stones are mute, but they are not the only voices from this place. There are other, smaller, more numerous witnesses. They fit in the palm of your hand, are struck in gold, silver, and bronze, and bear the faces of kings. They are the coins of Aksum, and they have a story to tell. A story not of silent stones, but of a thunderous, cosmopolitan, and fiercely ambitious empire that once commanded the trade of continents and dared to challenge the greatest powers of the ancient world. This is not a story of isolation, of a remote African kingdom lost in its own hills. This is the story of Aksum at its zenith, a story written on the waves of the Red Sea and the caravan trails of the Sahara, a story minted into currency that flowed from the markets of Rome to the ports of India. For nearly a millennium, from the 1st century to the 8th, the Aksumite Empire was the dominant force between the Nile and the Indian Ocean. It was a place where African, Arabian, Mediterranean, and Asian currents met and merged. It was a Christian kingdom that grew rich on the ivory, gold, and incense of its own hinterlands, and the luxuries of a connected world. Its rulers, with names like Endubis, Ezana, Caleb, and Arma, did not see themselves as peripheral players. They saw themselves as kings of kings, as conquerors, as gods chosen, and as equals to the emperors in Constantinople and the shahs in Ctesiphon. Our guides through this glittering, complex world are these coins. Unlike the imposing Stelae, coins are intimate. They pass from hand to hand, from the royal treasury to the merchant's purse, from the tax collector to the soldier's paymaster. They are economic tools, yes, but they are also mass-produced propaganda, miniature billboards broadcasting a king's authority, his faith, and his vision for his realm. Every symbol is deliberate: the disc and crescent of the old gods, the cross of the new Christian faith, the wheat stalks of prosperity, the royal portrait proclaiming sovereignty. By reading these symbols, by tracing the journeys they made, we can reconstruct the empire's grand narrative. We begin with a single, transformative moment, a military conquest that announced Aksum's arrival as a regional power and set the stage for its golden age. The moment a king named Ezana looked north, to the ancient and fading kingdom of Kush, and saw not a neighbor but an obstacle. The kingdom of Kush, with its capital at Meroe, was a legend. For centuries, it had been the dominant Nubian power, a civilization of pyramids and ironworks, once even ruling Egypt as the 25th dynasty. By the 4th century AD, its power was waning, but its legacy was immense. It controlled the Nile corridor to Aksum's north, a rival with deep roots and a long memory. For the ambitious kings of Aksum, Kush was a lingering shadow, a potential threat, and a barrier to greater influence. The man who would erase that shadow was King Ezana, who ruled in the first half of the 4th century. Ezana's reign is the pivot upon which Aksumite history turns, and his campaign against Kush is his defining military achievement. It was not merely a border skirmish, it was the calculated elimination of a peer competitor, a statement of intent carved not in stone, but in the annals of conquest. We know of this campaign from Ezana's own triumphant inscription, written in 3 languages: Ge'ez, the language of Aksum; Greek, the language of the wider Mediterranean world; and Sabaean, the language of South Arabia. This trilingual proclamation itself is a message. Aksum speaks to multiple audiences. In it, Ezana recounts his march. He tells of mobilizing his armies, of crossing the Tekeza River, of battling the forces of Kush. He names the towns he ravaged and the people he subdued. The inscription is a brutal, bureaucratic record of victory. And I burnt their towns, both those built of brick and those built of reeds. And my people took their corn and their bronze and their iron and their copper, and destroyed the statues in their temples, and their granaries and their cotton trees, and threw them into the river Seda. The detail is chilling. This was a war of annihilation aimed at the very infrastructure and identity of Kush. The smashing of statues and the felling of cotton trees were acts meant to demoralize and erase. The conquest of Kush was a geopolitical masterstroke. It removed a historic rival and secured Aksum's northwestern flank. It gave Aksum control over a stretch of the Nile, potentially opening new trade routes and securing access to gold mines. But more than that, it announced a new order. The legendary Kush, the kingdom that had once conquered Egypt, was now a subject of the Aksumite king. Ezana's inscription makes the new hierarchy clear. He now styled himself not just King of Aksum, but King of Aksum, and Himyar and Raydan and Saba and Salhen and Siamo and the Beja and of Kush. Kush was now a listed possession, a trophy and a growing imperial title. This victory resonated far beyond the African highlands. The Roman Empire, which had long dealt with Kush as a sometimes friendly, sometimes problematic neighbor to the south of Egypt, now had to reckon with a new, dynamic power on its southern frontier. Aksum was no longer a distant, exotic land. It was a contiguous empire, a military power that had proven its reach and its ruthlessness. Ezana's coins from this period tell a parallel story. Before his reign, Aksumite coinage was relatively simple, often imitating Roman designs. Under Ezana, it becomes distinctly, confidently, Aksumite. His portrait is not a crude copy of a Roman emperor. It is stylized, with distinctive Aksumite features, a tall, elaborate crown, and often a ribbon or diadem. The symbols on the reverse begin to shift, early in his reign, but a transformation is coming. The conquest of Kush marks the peak of Ezana's secular, imperial power. What follows is a spiritual revolution that will be etched just as permanently into the kingdom's metal. The victory over an ancient earthly kingdom would soon be followed by an embrace of a new heavenly kingdom. But for now, the message was pure imperial ambition. Aksum had arrived, and an old power had fallen to make way for it. To understand the world Ezana's conquest helped secure, we must step down from the throne and into the bustling, dusty, fragrant reality of the empire's economic heartbeat. Let us follow a single thread in Aksum's vast commercial tapestry, the journey of a merchant from the kingdom of Himyar in the highlands of modern-day Yemen. His name is Madkarib, and he is a man of the sea and the marketplace. His story begins in the port of Aden, a natural harbour buzzing with the languages of the Indian Ocean. He loads his sturdy, square-rigged vessel with sacks of aromatic frankincense and myrrh, harvested from the scraggly trees of his homeland, and with finely woven textiles. His destination is the Aksumite port of Adulis, some 2 weeks' sail across the Red Sea, depending on the winds. Adulis, when Madkarib sights it, is a spectacle of organized chaos. Described by the anonymous 6th century author of the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, and later by the Byzantine scholar Cosmas Indicopoulos, Adulis was the principal emporium of the Aksumite Empire. From the deck of his ship, Madkarib sees a forest of masts. He hears the shouts of stevedores in Ge'ez, Greek and Cushitic languages, the braying of donkeys, the creak of cranes lifting Egyptian wheat or Indian steel. The harbour is a geography of trade. Over there are the Roman naviculari, shipping agents managing the grain and wine from the Mediterranean. There, the sleek dhow-like vessels from the Persian Gulf, carrying dates and pearls, and just docking, a large Aksumite ship, its timbers stained from a long voyage from the far southern port of Avalites, near the Horn of Africa, laden with the most coveted cargo of all, ivory. This is what Madkarib has come for. Aksumite ivory, from the herds of elephants that roamed the interior south of the highlands, was legendary. It was denser, less prone to splitting, and had a warmer hue than Indian ivory, making it the most prized in the Roman world for diptychs, statuettes, and furniture inlays. After paying his harbour dues and making offerings to the local gods, or, in later centuries, giving thanks at a Christian chapel, Madkarib heads into the market. The air is thick with the smell of spices, animal hides, and humanity. He passes stalls selling African goods, rhinoceros horn, tortoiseshell, live monkeys and baboons for the exotic pet trade, gold dust measured out in precise weights, and emeralds from the mines of the eastern desert. He sees Aksumite officials, easily identifiable by their dress and bearing, collecting taxes not in kind, but in the clinking currency of the realm, the gold solidus, the silver denarius, and the bronze nummus. The use of coin here is pervasive, a sign of a sophisticated, monetized economy. Madkarib's bargaining for ivory is a ritual. He meets with an Aksumite broker, a middleman who controls access to the royal warehouses where the tusks are stored. The king holds a monopoly on ivory, and all large tusks must be sold to the royal treasury, which then sells them at a premium to merchants like Madkarib. The haggling is intense, conducted in a mix of broken Greek and gestures. Prices are quoted in Aksumite coin, but also measured against the Roman solidus, which was the gold standard of the ancient world. Madkarib knows the Aksumite gold coin is meticulously struck to the same weight and purity as the Roman one, a deliberate policy to ensure its acceptance everywhere. He examines the coins he's asked to pay with. They bear the portrait of the current Aksumite king, a profile in a radiant crown. He flips one. On the reverse, perhaps a cross, or a cluster of grapes, or a sheaf of wheat. This is not just money, it is a tiny ambassador, spreading the image of Aksumite sovereignty with every transaction. Successful, Madkarib loads his precious tusks, now stamped with the royal seal, onto his ship. He will also take on other African goods, Perhaps some of the famous Aksumite glassware, actually produced locally from imported raw materials, or some of the Highland-grown coffee, though it was not yet the global commodity it would become. His return cargo will make him wealthy in Himyar, but his journey illustrates the lifeblood of Aksum. It was a mercantile empire, a hub. It did not just produce its own goods, it facilitated, taxed, and controlled the exchange between continents. The multicultural bustle of Adulis, mirrored in smaller markets across the realm, was the engine of Aksum's wealth. This wealth built the Stelae, financed the armies, and minted the coins. And it was all protected by a formidable reality. Aksum's dominion did not stop at the water's edge. The Red Sea was not a border, it was an Aksumite lake. This control of both sides of the Red Sea is the crucial, often overlooked, logistical foundation of Aksum's power. On the African side lay the core, the capital city of Aksum with its palaces and Stelae fields, the agricultural highlands, the ports of Adulis and later Adults. But directly across the narrow straits, on the Arabian Peninsula, lay the coast of Himyar and, critically, parts of the mountainous interior. At various points in its history, particularly under kings like Izana and Caleb, Aksum exercised direct political control over swathes of South Arabia. This was not a casual influence, it was imperial rule. Aksumite governors were installed, troops were garrisoned, and coins were minted bearing the Aksumite king's name and title as King of the Himyarites. Why was this so vital? The reasons were strategic and economic. First, it secured the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the choke point between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Whoever controlled both shores controlled maritime traffic. Pirates could be suppressed, rival powers could be blocked, and Aksum's own merchant fleet could move with impunity. Second, South Arabia was itself a source of immense wealth. It was the home of the frankincense and myrrh trade, sacred commodities in the ancient world for religious rituals and medicine. Controlling this production at the source meant Aksum could dictate terms and prices to the Mediterranean world. Third, it gave Aksum a foothold in the complex politics of the Arabian Peninsula, allowing it to project power, form alliances with tribal confederations, and counter the influence of the Persian Empire, which was always eyeing the region. Ruling a maritime empire of this nature presented unique challenges. Communication across the Red Sea, though a relatively short distance, was subject to the whims of wind and current. The summer monsoon winds blew from the southwest, favoring travel from Africa to Arabia. The winter winds reversed. Administrators and military commanders had to plan movements and dispatches around these seasonal patterns. News of a rebellion in Himyar would take weeks to reach Aksum, and the mobilization of a fleet to respond would take months. This required a decentralized structure of trusted viceroys and a powerful, independent navy capable of acting as both a police force and a rapid reaction military arm. The logistical reality was one of constant movement and connection. Ships carried more than goods, they carried administrators, soldiers, diplomats, and pilgrims. The flow was bidirectional. South Arabian ideas, architectural styles, and script influences flowed into Aksum. The Ge'ez script is derived from a South Arabian prototype. Aksumite culture, and later Christianity, flowed into Himyar. This trans-Red Sea realm created a unique cultural hybrid. An Aksumite official in a Himyarite port city would have felt somewhat at home, and a Himyarite merchant in Adulis was not in a foreign land, but in another province of the same empire. This duality made Aksum unique among ancient powers. It was neither a purely land-based empire like Rome at its heart, nor a purely maritime network like the Phoenicians. It was a hybrid, a thalassocracy anchored to a powerful territorial core, its authority literally bridging continents. And the enforcers of that authority, the men who braved the treacherous waters to bind this empire together, were the sailors of the Aksumite navy. Life for an Aksumite sailor was a testament to human endurance and the lure of distant wealth. Their world was the wooden deck of a ship, the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, and the rhythm of the monsoons. These were not the triremes of the Mediterranean, built for speed and ramming in confined seas. Aksumite vessels, like the Macrobia described by Greek sources, were stout, high-sided cargo ships, built for capacity and ocean-going stability. Their hulls were sewn together with coconut fiber cordage, a technique that gave flexibility in heavy swells. They were powered by a single large square sail, made of woven cotton or palm matting on a central mast. Steering was by two large quarter rudders on the stern. It was a design perfected over centuries for the specific challenges of the Indian Ocean trade. A sailor's journey was dictated by the monsoon winds. The southwest monsoon, blowing from April to September, was the great driver of trade to the east. An Aksumite ship leaving Adulis in July, laden with ivory, tortoiseshell and rhinoceros horn, would catch this wind and be carried across the open ocean to the shores of India or Sri Lanka, a voyage that could take 2 months or more. This was a time of monotony and hardship. The sailor's diet was hardtack, dried fish, lentils, and precious fresh water stored in clay amphorae, which often grew foul. He battled sunstroke, storms that could appear with terrifying speed, and the ever-present fear of pirates from the Persian Gulf or the coast of Arabia. Navigation was by the stars, by the color of the water, by the flight of birds, and by the accumulated oral lore passed down from captain to pilot. But the destination justified the peril. The ports of India Barbaricon at the mouth of the Indus, Barigaza on the west coast, Muziris on the pepper-rich Malabar coast were gateways to unimaginable luxuries. Here, the Aksumite trader, acting for himself or as an agent for a royal merchant, would exchange his African goods for a fortune: fine Indian cotton and muslin, pearls from the Gulf of Manna, diamonds and other precious stones, pepper, the black gold of the ancient world, and, most exotically, silk from China, which had been transported overland to Indian markets. There was also steel from the furnaces of the Deccan, famed for its quality. Once the hull was filled, the ship would wait for the wind to reverse. The northeast monsoon from November to March would then blow it reliably back to the Red Sea and home. The return to Adulis was a moment of triumph and relief. The sailor, paid in a mix of coin and a share of the cargo, would step onto solid ground, his pockets heavier, his stories wilder. He had seen the world. He had traded with Romans, Indians, Persians, and perhaps even glimpsed goods from far-off Southeast Asia. This constant circulation, African out, Asian in, was what filled the Aksumite treasury. The royal court was adorned with Indian gems and Chinese silks. The liturgy in the great cathedral of Aksum might be conducted with incense from Arabia, using a chalice made of Indian metalwork. The navy was the circulatory system of this commercial body, and the sailor was its red blood cell, carrying the oxygen of trade. And the fuel for this entire system, the token that greased every transaction from the highlands of Himyar to the markets of Muziris, was Aksum's most brilliant innovation, its own independent, trusted gold coinage. In a world without mass media, coinage was the most powerful and pervasive form of propaganda. Every issued piece was a promise of value and a declaration of sovereignty. The Aksumite kings understood this with a sophistication that matched Rome and Persia. Their gold coinage in particular was a masterclass in political messaging. From its inception under King Endubis around 270 AD, it broke from tradition. While neighboring kingdoms often used crude imitations of Roman coins, Aksum struck its own, with its own designs, its own weight standard initially, and its own language. This was an act of profound confidence. It said, "Our kingdom is economically self-sufficient and politically independent. Our money is as good as Rome's, but it is distinctly ours." The portrait on the obverse is the first message. The Aksumite king is always shown in profile, but it is a highly stylized, symbolic profile. The features are often idealized, with a strong jaw, large almond-shaped eye, and an expression of serene authority. The crown is the most important element, an elaborate, towering headpiece, sometimes with ribbons or diadems flowing from it, often depicted with radiating lines, suggesting the sun or divine glory. This is not a realistic portrait. it is an icon of kingship. It communicates power, stability, and a connection to the divine. The inscriptions in the elegant Gaia's script reinforce this: King of Aksum, or, as empires expanded, King of Kings. The reverse of the coin is where the narrative unfolds. In the pre-Christian period, the dominant symbol was the disc and crescent, representing the chief deities. This placed Aksum within a recognizable cosmological order for its diverse subjects and trading partners. But the most dramatic shift in Aksumite propaganda coincides with the conversion to Christianity in the mid-4th century, traditionally attributed to King Ezana and his tutor, Frumentius. The change on the coinage is immediate and unmistakable. The disc and crescent vanish. In their place appears the Christian cross. At first, it might be a simple Greek cross within a wreath. Later, it becomes more elaborate, a cross potent, or a cross mounted on steps. This was a public, permanent, and irreversible declaration. Every transaction, every payment of tax, every soldier's salary now carried a tiny proclamation: Aksum is a Christian kingdom. But the propaganda was nuanced. Alongside the cross, other symbols spoke of earthly prosperity and royal legitimacy. Sheaves of wheat symbolized abundance and the agricultural wealth of the highlands. Clusters of grapes could represent both fertility and the Eucharistic wine of the new faith. Sometimes the king himself was shown holding a spear and a shield, or with a ceremonial scarf emphasizing his role as defender and ruler. The coins also broadcast military victory. After a successful campaign, a king might issue coins showing him holding a sword or standing triumphantly over a bound captive. The message was holistic. The king rules by the grace of God signified by the cross, brings material prosperity, wheat and grapes, and secures the realm through military might, weapons. It was a complete political theology in miniature, circulating by the thousands. This sophisticated use of coinage placed Aksum in direct dialogue with its great rivals. To the Roman merchant, the Aksumite solidus was reassuringly familiar in weight and purity, but its imagery was intriguingly different, a statement of equal status under a different divine patronage. To the Persian trader, it was a reminder of a powerful Christian state on the southern flank of their empire. To the chieftain in South Arabia or the merchant in India, it was the tangible symbol of a reliable, wealthy, and sophisticated power. The coins were more than money. They were the empire's voice, whispering its claims of faith, power, and legitimacy into the palm of every hand that held them. And this voice was about to speak on the grandest stage of all, in the complex, three-way struggle for influence that defined the late ancient world. The 6th century AD was a world dominated by a Cold War between two superpowers, the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, and the Sasanian Persian Empire, centered in Ctesiphon. Their rivalry was ideological, economic, and military, stretching from the walls of Mesopotamia to the deserts of Arabia. And in this bipolar contest, the kingdom of Aksum emerged as a decisive third power, a swing state whose allegiance and actions could tip the balance in a critical theater, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian Ocean trade routes. Aksum was not a passive pawn. It was an active, sometimes aggressive, independent player with its own imperial ambitions, particularly in South Arabia. The flashpoint was, again, Himyar. By the early 6th century, the local Himyarite rulers had thrown off Aksumite overlordship. More alarmingly for both Aksum and Byzantium, the Himyarite king, Yusuf Azar Yathar, also known as Du-Nuwas, had converted to Judaism and began persecuting the Christian community in his realm, which included Aksumite merchants and diplomats. A brutal massacre at the city of Najran, where hundreds of Christians were killed, sent shockwaves through the Christian world. To Constantinople, this was a religious outrage and a strategic threat. A Persian-aligned, or at least non-Christian power, could dominate the Red Sea and threaten Byzantine trade. To Aksum, it was an intolerable challenge to its historical sphere of influence and a direct attack on its co-religionists. The Byzantine Emperor Justin I saw an opportunity. He could not commit his own overstretched legions to a distant Arabian war, but he could empower a proxy. He made a formal appeal to the Aksumite king Caleb, urging him, as a fellow Christian monarch, to intervene and protect the faithful. He also offered practical support, likely shipbuilding materials and perhaps even naval engineers. Caleb needed little encouragement. Here was a chance to reassert Aksumite control over Himyar, cast himself as a champion of Christendom, and secure a powerful alliance with Rome. Around 525 AD, Caleb launched a massive amphibious invasion across the Red Sea. His fleet, perhaps aided by Byzantine technical aid, carried a large Aksumite army. The campaign was successful. Dunuwas was defeated and killed, and Aksumite rule was restored under a Christian viceroy, Sumyafa Ashwa. This event cemented Aksum's role in the Great Game. It was now the officially recognized Christian power of the Red Sea, acting as Constantinople's right hand in the south. Aksumite coins from this period proudly proclaim Caleb's titles, including his lordship over Himyar. For a time, Aksumite influence was at its peak. But the Cold War dynamics were unstable. The Aksumite viceroy in Himyar was later overthrown by a disgruntled local leader, Abraha, who declared independence. Even Abraha, however, maintained the Christian character of the kingdom and continued to acknowledge, at least nominally, a special relationship with Aksum. The famous Year of the Elephant, mentioned in the Quran, in which Abraham marched on Mecca with an army that included war elephants, is a testament to the power projection of this Aksumite-inspired polity. Aksum's position as the third power had limits. When the Sasanian Persians finally decided to directly conquer South Arabia in the late 6th century, Aksum could not stop them. The Aksumite navy, formidable in the Red Sea, was no match for the full might of the Persian fleet in the open Indian Ocean. The loss of the Arabian foothold was a major blow, yet for nearly a century, Aksum had played the part of a near equal. It negotiated with emperors and shahs. It fielded armies that could project power across the sea. Its religious alignment with Rome gave it ideological weight. In the intricate diplomacy of the age, Aksum was a kingdom that could not be ignored, a regional hegemon whose choices mattered on a global scale. And underpinning this confident Christian imperial identity was a profound and mysterious tension, a duality between the new public faith and an ancient secret source of power believed to reside at the very heart of the kingdom. Amidst the very public displays of faith on coinage and in foreign wars, there persisted a deep private mystery central to Aksum's self-conception, the Ark of the Covenant. According to Ethiopian tradition, revered for over a millennium, the Ark, the sacred chest containing the tablets of the law given to Moses, was brought to Aksum from Jerusalem by Menelik I, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Here, it found its final resting place, guarded to this day in a special chapel adjacent to the Church of St. Seo. Mary of Zion in Aksum, accessible only to a single guardian monk. This belief is not a later medieval invention. Its roots likely stretch back to the very zenith of the Aksumite Empire. It presents a fascinating paradox. A kingdom that so publicly embraced the cross of Christianity also claimed to hold the ultimate relic of the Old Testament, the very throne of the God of Israel. This creates a compelling link to the coinage and the nature of Aksumite kingship. Before Ezana's conversion, the symbols on coins, the disk and crescent, spoke of a celestial, perhaps astral, divinity. The king was likely seen as the son or chosen of these gods, possibly specifically of Mahrum, a god of war often identified with the king himself. Where was the Ark in this early cosmology? We cannot know for certain, but if the tradition has an early core, it may have represented a powerful hidden source of divine legitimacy, a connection to a different, older, and even more potent divine narrative, linking Aksum to Jerusalem and the legacy of Solomon. It was not a symbol for public coins, it was the ultimate state secret, the hidden wellspring of Tabot, or holiness, that empowered the ruler. Then comes the conversion. The disk and crescent are very publicly retired from the coinage. The cross is very publicly installed. This is a revolutionary shift in public iconography. But what happened to the Ark in this new Christian framework? It was not discarded. Instead, it was seamlessly, brilliantly absorbed. The God of the Ark and the God of the Cross became one and the same. The Ark was now reinterpreted as the pre-Christian vessel of the same God who had now revealed himself fully in Christ. Its presence in Aksum was now proof of God's special providence for this kingdom, a sign that they were the new chosen people, the true inheritors of Israel's covenant. The king was no longer just the son of Mahram. He was the defender of Zion, the guardian of the Ark, a Christian ruler with a direct lineage to Solomon. One could imagine a king like Azana or Caleb on campaign. Before battle, he would have publicly invoked the protection of the cross, the symbol minted on the coins that paid his troops. His soldiers might have worn cross pendants. But in the privacy of his tent, did he also pray for the intercession and power of the Ark, the ultimate palladium of his kingdom? The two faiths, the public, cosmopolitan Christianity of the cross and the secret, nationalistic tradition of the Ark, were not in conflict, they were fused. The cross was the empire's face to the world, the sign of its membership in the universal Christian community alongside Rome. The Ark was its heart, the unique, unparalleled source of its divine election and national pride. The coinage tells the story of the public face. The silent, guarded chapel in Aksum whispers the story of the heart. This duality may have been the secret to Aksum's remarkable confidence. It was a kingdom that believed it was under the special protection of God, not just as a recent convert, but as the eternal resting place of his most sacred earthly throne. The coins of the Conqueror, from Izana's triumphant portrait to Caleb's Christian cross, tell a story of meteoric rise and confident sovereignty. They speak of an empire that mastered its geography, turning the Red Sea into a highway and the monsoons into a schedule. They reveal a society that was open to the world, drawing wealth from India and ideas from Rome, yet fiercely proud of its own identity, minting that identity into gold. They show us a kingdom that played the Cold War game with cunning and force, positioning itself as the indispensable third power between the eagle and the lion. And they hint, in their symbolic evolution, at the profound spiritual journey of a people who grafted a universal faith onto a deeply rooted, singular tradition of divine election. But the world changes. The winds of trade shift, new powers rise. The very success of Aksum sowed the seeds of future challenges. The Persian conquest of South Arabia in the late 6th century severed a vital limb. The rise of Islam in the 7th century transformed the entire geopolitical and economic landscape of the Red Sea and beyond. The unified Islamic Caliphate, bursting out of Arabia, would eventually dominate the trade routes that had been Aksum's lifeblood. The empire began to contract, retreating from its maritime horizons back into its highland fortress. The gold coinage, that proud symbol of economic independence, ceased by the early 8th century. The age of the Conqueror was passing, yet Aksum did not disappear. It transformed. Its heart continued to beat around the belief in the Ark. Its faith, now isolated from a shrinking Christian world, deepened and took on a unique, resilient character. The story of the cross, so boldly proclaimed on the coins, was far from over. It was entering a new chapter, one not of imperial expansion, but of spiritual consolidation, artistic flowering, and survival against the odds. The great Stelae still stood, but now they watched over a different kingdom, a kingdom of monks, scribes, and pilgrims, who would forge a Christian civilization that could endure long after the last gold solidus had been spent. The narrative of Aksum was turning inward, from the palace and the port to the monastery and the church. This brings us to the Sun and the Cross, revolution of faith. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, atop a plateau that seems to touch the very heavens, stand the silent, soaring obelisks of Aksum. They are monuments of a forgotten empire, testaments in stone to a power that once commanded the trade routes between the ancient worlds of Rome and India. For centuries, these stelae have cast their long shadows, guardians of a history both magnificent and mysterious. But the greatest story etched into this landscape is not one of mere commerce or territorial conquest. It is a story of a profound and sudden transformation, a spiritual revolution that would forever alter the identity of a nation and the course of a continent. This is the story of how the sun and the crescent were eclipsed by the cross. How a kingdom, deeply rooted in its own powerful traditions, encountered a faith from a distant sea, and, in a single sovereign's lifetime, turned its heart and its symbols towards a new god. It is a pivotal moment, a hinge upon which history swings, where personal conviction meets political destiny, and where an ancient African empire becomes the cornerstone of a unique and enduring Christian civilization. To understand the magnitude of this change, we must first listen to the old gods. Before the cross, there was the sun. The kingdom of Aksum, by the 3rd and 4th centuries, was a formidable power. Its wealth flowed from a controlled monopoly on ivory, frankincense, and the exotic goods of the African interior. Its kings, styling themselves kings of kings, ruled with an authority that was both political and profoundly sacred. At the center of the Aksumite celestial pantheon stood Marum, a god of war and a god of kings. He was not a distant deity but a divine ancestor, a progenitor. Each Aksumite king was considered the son of the invincible Marum, a direct descendant whose right to rule was divinely ordained. Marum was associated with the planet Mars, the red wanderer in the night sky, a fitting symbol for a warrior king. Alongside him existed an astral triad, Astar, the god of the sky and the heavens, Beha, a god of the sea or earth often invoked in inscriptions, and Meda, a personification of the earth itself. The moon god, Almakar, borrowed from the Sabaeans across the Red Sea, also held sway. Their symbols, the disc and crescent-adorned royal insignia, coinage, and the grand stone thrones that served as sites of coronation and judgment. Religion was the bedrock of the state, a cosmic contract where the king, as the son of Marum, ensured the fertility of the land and the victory of its armies through ritual and sacrifice. The world was ordered, predictable, its rhythms tied to the movements of celestial bodies and the potency of ancestral gods. This was the spiritual universe into which two young boys, entirely by accident, would one day step, carrying with them the seeds of an idea that would shatter this ancient cosmos and build a new one from its fragments. The story of this seismic shift begins not with a royal decree or a theological debate, but with a shipwreck. Sometime in the early 4th century, a merchant vessel sailing the Red Sea foundered off the Aksumite coast. Among its passengers were two Syrian Christian youths from Tyre, Frumentius and Odysseus. They were taken captive and brought to the royal court at Aksum. Their fate, it seemed, was to be one of servitude or perhaps ransom. But the intelligence and bearing of the young men, particularly Frumentius, caught the attention of the then king, Ella Amida. He appointed them to positions of trust within the royal household. Odysseus became the king's cupbearer, while Frumentius, displaying a keen administrative mind, served as the king's secretary and treasurer. They learned the local language, Giez, and immersed themselves in the customs and complexities of the Aksumite court. They were insiders by circumstance, outsiders by origin. When King Ella Amida died, he left his wife, the queen, as regent for their young heir, Ezana. In this moment of transition, the queen made a pivotal request of the two foreigners. She asked them to stay and help administer the kingdom, and crucially, to assist in the education and upbringing of the young prince Ezana. This was the opening, the crack in the door of history. For years, Frumentius and Odysseus served the crown. While Odysseus attended to practical duties, Frumentius, a devout Christian, found his calling. He did not preach openly or attempt to subvert the state religion. His influence was subtler, more personal. As a tutor and advisor to the prince, he would have shared not only knowledge of languages and administration, but also the stories and principles of his faith. He spoke of a God, not of war and lineage, but of love and sacrifice. A God who had walked among humanity in a distant Roman province who had died and risen again. He spoke of a kingdom not of this world, yet one that could transform the world from within. The young Ezana grew up with this dual spiritual inheritance, the official, martial cult of Marum, the divine ancestor, and the private, compelling narrative of a crucified and resurrected Savior. Meanwhile, Frumentius began to quietly seek out other Christian merchants residing in Aksum's cosmopolitan ports. He encouraged them, and with the regent's permission, helped them establish places of prayer. A small, nascent Christian community began to take root, not through conquest, but through commerce and quiet persuasion. After years of service, Odysseus eventually returned to his homeland. Frumentius, however, felt his work was unfinished. He journeyed to Alexandria, the great theological center of Christendom, and met with the newly consecrated patriarch, Athanasius. He presented him with a report on the state of Christianity in Aksum and the unique opportunity that lay before them. Recognizing the moment, Athanasius did not send a delegation of missionaries. Instead, he consecrated Frumentius himself as the first bishop of Aksum, declaring him Abba Salama, the Father of Peace. Frumentius, the once captive, returned to the kingdom of his captivity not as a servant, but as a bishop, carrying the full apostolic authority of the Alexandrian Church. He returned to a young king, Ezana, who had now come of age and taken the full reins of power. The stage was set for a decision that would echo through millennia. King Ezana's conversion was not merely a political calculation. It was, by all accounts, a profound personal spiritual revelation. The exact catalyst remains shrouded in the mists of time and piety, but the traditional Ethiopian chronicles speak of a transformative experience. Having been prepared by Frumentius's teachings from his youth, Ezana embraced Christianity with the fervor of a convert. In 32 AD, a date now etched into the foundation of Ethiopian identity, Ezana made his declaration. He was baptized, and he declared the kingdom of Aksum a Christian state. The political consequences of this personal faith were monumental and immediate. The king, the very son of Marem, had renounced his divine ancestry. The cosmic contract was broken and rewritten. The state's legitimacy would no longer flow from an ancestral war god, but from the God of the Apostles. This was a revolution from the top, the most efficient and total kind. Ezana did not see Christianity as a foreign imposition, but as a universal truth that could consolidate and elevate his kingdom, aligning it with the spiritual currents of the powerful Roman Empire to the north, now under the Christian Emperor Constantine. It was a move of both devotion and realpolitik, connecting Aksum to a wider, transcontinental network of faith and power. The conversion was an act of sovereignty, a deliberate choice to redefine the soul of the nation. The evidence of this revolution is not found in ancient texts alone, it is stamped in metal and carved in stone. The coins of Aksum provide a breathtakingly clear timeline of this theological upheaval. In the early years of Ezana's reign, the currency bore the traditional symbols, the disk and the crescent of the sun and moon gods. They proclaimed the king's might by the grace of Marem. In their place, the cross. Not just any cross, but a confident, equal-armed cross, often flanked by stalks of wheat or clusters of grapes, symbols of the Eucharist. The inscriptions changed just as decisively. The legend now reads, "By the grace of God," or "Through the faith in God and the power of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." The transformation is total and unambiguous. The very medium of economic power and royal propaganda now broadcast the new faith to every corner of the empire and to every trading partner across the known world. Similarly, the royal inscriptions tell the same story. Earlier victories Stelae, like the one commemorating a campaign against the Nubians, give thanks to Marem and the astral gods for success. A later inscription detailing Ezana's conquest of the Beja peoples is starkly different. It begins, "In the faith of God and the power of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, who saved for me the kingdom." It goes on to condemn the sin and injustice of the defeated, framing the military campaign as a holy act. The language of the state had been baptized. The warrior king, once the instrument of Mahram, now saw himself as an instrument of the Christian God. The sun and crescent had set, the dawn of the cross had arrived. But this was not a simple case of one religion replacing another. The Aksumite mind, deeply spiritual and anchored in a sense of chosenness, performed a remarkable act of theological synthesis. The foundation for this was a tradition that predated Christianity's arrival, the belief that the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest containing the tablets of the law given to Moses, resided in Ethiopia. The epic narrative of the Kebra Nagast, the glory of kings, would later codify this story, telling of Menelik I, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, who brought the Ark from Jerusalem to Aksum. This tradition provided a powerful bridge. For the newly Christianized Aksumites, the Ark was no longer just a Judaic relic from a distant past. It became the ultimate Christian relic. It was the throne of the God of Israel, who was now understood to be the God revealed in Jesus Christ. The God who had dwelt in mercy above the Ark in the Holy of Holies was the same God who had walked in Galilee. This seamless absorption meant Christianity did not feel like a foreign import. It felt like a homecoming, a fulfillment of a destiny laid down centuries before. The Ark provided a tangible, awe-inspiring link to the biblical narrative, making Ethiopia not a peripheral convert, but a central player in sacred history. To house this most sacred of objects, King Ezana, under the guidance of Frumentius, founded the Church of St. Mary of Zion in Aksum. It became, and remains, the spiritual epicenter of Ethiopian Christianity. The Ark, or Tabot, its symbolic representation, became the heart of every Ethiopian church. Thus, Christianity was grafted onto a deep, pre-existing root of Judaic tradition. The cross did not erase the past, it reinterpreted it, creating a theological continuum that was uniquely Ethiopian. From this fusion of apostolic teaching, royal sanction, and ancient Judaic tradition, a distinct Christian identity was born, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. Tewahedo means unity, specifically the unified nature of Christ as fully divine and fully human, a Christological stance that placed the Church in a family of Oriental Orthodox churches, distinct from both Rome and Constantinople. This was an African Christianity, developing its own character from its very inception. Its liturgy was and is conducted in Ge'ez, the ancient Semitic language of Aksum, a sacred tongue that connects the faithful directly to the era of conversion. Its rhythms were set by a unique calendar of fasts and festivals. Its architecture shaped by the indigenous styles of the Highlands, evolving from the Aksumite basilica to the iconic round church. Its art, with its large, expressive eyes and vibrant colors, developed a visual theology all its own, telling the stories of the Bible and the saints through a distinctly Ethiopian lens. The church became the guardian of culture, the scribe of history, and the moral compass of the state. Monasticism took deep root, with remote communities becoming centers of learning, preserving ancient texts, and producing profound works of theology and poetry. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church was not a passive recipient of doctrine from Alexandria. While it maintained a spiritual connection and received its abuna, or patriarch, from the Coptic Church for centuries, it nurtured a fiercely independent spirit. It developed a vast corpus of literature beyond the standard biblical canon, including the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, which it held as sacred. It wove its own saints, like the 9 saints who revitalized the church in later centuries, into its spiritual tapestry. This was a faith that wore Ethiopian skin, spoke an Ethiopian language, and answered the deepest questions of the Ethiopian soul. It created a civilization where faith and identity became inseparable. The conversion of King Ezana was not an end, but a magnificent beginning. It set in motion the creation of a Christian kingdom that would endure, often in isolation, through the rise and fall of empires around it. The cross on the coins of Aksum was a declaration to the world, but it was also a promise to future generations. That promise would be tested by time, by internal strife, and by external pressures, but the foundation laid in those decisive decades of the 4th century would prove unshakable. From the obelisks of pagan Aksum to the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, a direct line can be drawn, a line of faith, of resilience, and of a unique cultural synthesis. The sun and crescent may have set, but in their place rose a cross that would illuminate a civilization for over a millennium and a half, creating a nation that saw itself as a new Zion, a covenant people under the gaze of their own mountain. This brings us to the kingdom of Prester John, Aksum, in the medieval world. The kingdom of Prester John, Aksum, in the medieval world. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, under the vast and unforgiving sky, stand silent sentinels of a forgotten age. The great Stelae of Aksum, hewn from single blocks of solid stone, rise like frozen giants from the earth. To the modern eye, they are enigmatic, austere, monuments to an ambition we can scarcely comprehend. But 1,500 years ago, they were not symbols of mystery, but of manifest power. They marked the heart of a metropolis that was the equal of Rome, Persia, or Byzantium. This was Aksum, a kingdom of immense wealth, of towering ambition, a naval power that controlled the trade routes between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean, a civilization that minted its own gold coinage bearing the faces of its kings, and a state that, in the 4th century, embraced Christianity, becoming one of the first kingdoms on earth to do so. Aksum was a beacon, a nexus, a player on the world stage. But history is a tide, and even the greatest empires cannot hold back the sea. The Aksum we imagine today, remote, isolated, shrouded in the mists of legend, is not the Aksum of antiquity. That Aksum was connected, cosmopolitan, and confident. Its port of Adulis on the Red Sea was a bustling emporium where spices from India, silk from China, and glass from Rome changed hands. Its fleets patrolled the Arabian coast. Its ambassadors were received in Constantinople. It was a kingdom that mattered. Yet, the narrative that has come down to us in the West is not of this mercantile and political powerhouse, but of something else entirely. A mythical kingdom ruled by a mysterious priest-king named Prester John, a Christian champion besieged by infidels, guarding unimaginable relics in a land of wonders. This legend, which captivated the medieval European mind for centuries, is a phantom, a distorted echo. But every phantom has a source. The legend of Prester John is the ghost of the kingdom of Aksum, whispering its story through the centuries of its isolation. This is the story of that transformation. It is the tale of how a real, formidable empire slowly faded from the geopolitical map, only to re-emerge in the European imagination as a fabulist's dream. It is a chronicle of retreat, of resilience, and of reinvention. We will journey from the bustling docks of Adulis to the fortress-like Amba, or flat-top mountains, of the Ethiopian interior. We will see how a civilization, cut off from its economic lifeblood, turned inwards, forging a new identity from faith and rock. We will explore how the tangible reality of Aksum's power, its coins, its ships, its diplomatic correspondence, was gradually replaced by the intangible power of a supreme relic, the Ark of the Covenant, said to rest in the holy city of Aksum itself. This belief would become the central pillar of a national consciousness, the proof of divine favor during centuries of encirclement. We will witness the extraordinary response of the Zagwe dynasty, who, in the 12th century, attempted to build a new Jerusalem not in stone, but by sculpting it directly from the living rock of the mountains at Lalibela. And we will meet the true guardians of the flame, the monastic communities, who in their remote mountain fastnesses preserved the ancient language of Ge'ez, copied and illuminated priceless manuscripts, and meticulously kept the historical records that would allow the story of Aksum to survive its own decline. This is the story of a kingdom that refused to vanish, that traded an empire of the sea for a kingdom of the spirit, and in doing so, authored one of the most enduring and poignant legends of the medieval world. This is the journey from Aksum to Abyssinia, from history into myth and back again. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a slow, inexorable constriction. For Aksum, the 7th century AD brought a geopolitical earthquake that would fundamentally reshape its destiny. The event was the rise of Islam. In the span of a few decades, the armies of the nascent Islamic Caliphate exploded out of the Arabian Peninsula, conquering the mighty Persian Empire and wresting the provinces of Syria, Egypt, and North Africa from a weakened Byzantium. For Aksum, this was a catastrophe of existential proportions. The kingdom had long enjoyed a symbiotic, if sometimes tense, relationship with the powers across the Red Sea. Aksum's wealth was maritime wealth. Its power was projection across the water. The Red Sea was not a barrier, it was Aksum's highway, its lifeline, its source of vitality. The new Islamic powers now controlled both shores of that sea. The Arabian coast, once within Aksum's sphere of influence, was firmly under the Caliphate's dominion. Soon, the African coast, including the vital port of Adulis, would become a frontier, vulnerable and exposed. The unified trade network that had stretched from the Mediterranean to India was now fractured. The Christian kingdom of Aksum found itself an isolated island in a rapidly expanding Islamic sea. The economic lifeblood of the kingdom, the taxes and tariffs from the Red Sea trade, began to drain away. No longer could Aksumite merchants act as the crucial middlemen between the Mediterranean world and the East. That role was now assumed by Muslim traders operating within the vast, unified territory of the caliphates. Aksum's gold coins, once a common sight in markets from Alexandria to Ceylon, gradually ceased to be minted. The flow of luxury goods and the wealth they represented slowed to a trickle. This was more than an economic blockade, it was a profound cultural and psychological severance. Aksum was cut off from the wider Christian world, from the patriarchates of Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople. The easy exchange of clergy, theological ideas, and pilgrims became difficult, then dangerous, and finally nearly impossible. The kingdom that had once been an active participant in the great Christological debates of the early church now found itself on the periphery, developing its own unique traditions in isolation. The world was closing in. Archaeological evidence tells a stark story. The grand, multi-storied palaces of Aksum's capital, built with intricate masonry, were no longer constructed. Imported pottery, glass, and other goods from the Mediterranean and India, once commonplace, vanished from the archaeological record. The great city itself began to contract. The cosmopolitan bustle of the port city gave way to a quieter, more insular existence. The kingdom was forced to look inward, to rely on its own resources. The Highland plateau, always the agricultural heartland, now became the sole focus. The Aksumite state had to reinvent its economy from one based on international trade tariffs to one rooted in land tenure and agricultural production. It was a painful, fundamental transition, from a maritime power to a landlocked agrarian society. The gaze of the kingdom, which had once looked outward across the waves to Rome and India, now turned inward, toward the rugged, defensible mountains of the interior. The age of empire was over. The age of survival had begun. This survival demanded a strategic retreat, both literal and metaphorical. As the coasts became untenable and the old economic model collapsed, the political and spiritual center of gravity of the kingdom began to shift. It moved south and west, away from the vulnerable lowlands and the now distant sea, deeper into the fortress of the Ethiopian highlands. This was not a sudden, dramatic flight, but a gradual, centuries-long process of recentering. The ancient capital of Aksum, while never completely abandoned and always retaining its profound religious significance as the purported home of the Ark, began to lose its primary political function. Kings no longer ruled exclusively from the old Stelae field city. Instead, they took to the road. The Ethiopian plateau is punctuated by dramatic, flat-topped mountains known as ambas. These natural fortresses, with sheer cliff faces and accessible only by narrow, easily defensible paths, became the new nuclei of power. the kingdom evolved into a mobile, peripatetic monarchy. The royal court became an itinerant camp, a vast procession of soldiers, priests, artisans, and servants that moved from amber to amber across the highlands. The king was no longer a stationary ruler in a stone palace. He was a commander moving among his strongholds. This lifestyle, known as the wandering camp, was a direct adaptation to the new realities of insecurity and a more land-based economy. The king could oversee agricultural production, administer justice, project power, and, most importantly, remain safe from potential threats by never being a stationary target. This shift had profound implications for the nature of the state. Centralized bureaucracy, of the kind needed to manage complex international trade, gave way to a more feudal, militarized system. Power was delegated to regional lords, the Raises, who governed from their own fortified mountaintops. Loyalty was maintained through personal allegiance, land grants, and kinship ties, rather than through the impersonal machinery of a tax-collecting state. The very landscape shaped the new polity, fragmented, rugged, and defensive. The unity of the kingdom was now maintained not by control of sea lanes, but by the shared ideology of Christianity and the symbolic authority of the Solomonic lineage, a claim that would be powerfully articulated and reinforced in the coming centuries. The Highlands, while offering protection, also imposed a kind of isolation. The very mountains that made the kingdom unconquerable also made it inaccessible. The outside world receded further into the realm of rumor and legend. Within this mountain fortress, the people once known as Aksumites began to forge a new identity. They were becoming the Abyssinians. And at the core of this new identity was a sacred object, a tangible link to a glorious biblical past that could compensate for a diminished geopolitical present. That object was the Ark of the Covenant. Here, history and legend intertwined to form the bedrock of a national consciousness. According to Ethiopian tradition, enshrined in the epic 14th century text, the Kebre Nagast, or Glory of the Kings, the Ark of the Covenant. The sacred chest built at God's command to hold the tablets of the law, did not vanish from history after the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem's temple. Instead, the Kebre Nagast recounts that it was brought to Aksum by Menelik I, the son of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. Menelik, the narrative goes, traveled to Jerusalem to meet his father and, upon his return to Ethiopia, was accompanied by a retinue of Israelite firstborn sons who, divinely guided, secretly brought the ark with them. Thus, the covenant between God and the Israelites was transferred to a new chosen people, the Ethiopians. The ark found its eternal resting place in the Church of St. Ciar, Mary of Zion in Aksum, where it is said to remain to this day, guarded by a single virgin monk. The precise origins of this tradition are obscure and likely evolved over centuries, but its power and timing are unmistakably linked to Aksum's isolation. In a world where the kingdom was surrounded by powerful Islamic states and cut off from the communion of other Christian nations, the claim to possess the ark was a monumental statement. It was a theological and political declaration of unique divine election. It answered the profound psychological need of a besieged Christian island. If we are alone, it is because we are special. If we have lost our worldly empire, we have gained the ultimate spiritual treasure. The ark provided an unassailable legitimacy to the Ethiopian monarchy, which now claimed direct descent from Solomon and David. It made the Ethiopian church not just a branch of Christianity, but its rightful heir, the guardian of the original covenant. Aksum was not a remote outpost of the faith, it was the New Zion. This belief did not exist in a vacuum. It seeped out, in fragments and distortions, to the medieval West. European Christendom, itself under pressure from Islamic expansion, was gripped by a potent myth in the 12th century, the legend of Prester John. A letter, purportedly from this mighty Christian king, began to circulate among the courts of Europe. It described a fabulously wealthy and powerful empire in the Indies, east of the Islamic world, ruled by a priest king who was both a spiritual and temporal leader. This kingdom was a land of marvels, rivers of gems, forests of pepper, a fountain of youth. Most importantly, Prester John was a potential ally, a Christian champion who could smash the Muslim powers from the rear and help liberate Jerusalem. Crusader hopes were pinned on this phantom. While the letter was a work of fantasy, scholars have long argued that its core was a distorted reflection of the real Christian kingdom in the Ethiopian highlands. News of a powerful Christian ruler far to the south, beyond the lands of Islam, had likely reached Europe through pilgrims, traders, and diplomatic channels, however garbled. The title Prester John may be a corruption of Zan Hedge, a title for the Ethiopian king, or Jan Hoy, a title for the metropolitan of the Ethiopian church. The legend's details were pure medieval romance, but its anchor was the reality of Abyssinia. And central to the European conception of Prester John's realm was its possession of sacred wonders. In some versions of the myth, he guards the Fountain of Youth, in others, the Gates of Alexander. But the underlying theme is clear: his kingdom is a repository of divine favor and ancient power. This directly parallels the Ethiopian reality, where the ultimate sacred wonder, the Ark, was the foundation of the kingdom's identity. Thus, the Ark in its isolation became the unseen heart of the Prester John myth. Europe dreamed of a mighty ally who possessed magical relics. Ethiopia knew itself to be a chosen people who possessed the actual Ark of God. One was a fantasy of rescue, the other was a dogma of survival. The legend sustained European hopes for centuries, while the reality of the Ark sustained the Ethiopian nation through its long isolation. If the Ark provided the spiritual justification for the kingdom's divine election, then a staggering physical monument to that faith would be carved from the very bones of the earth. In the 12th and 13th centuries, a new dynasty rose to power in the Ethiopian highlands, the Zagwe. They were ethnically Agor, not claiming the Solomonic lineage of Aksum, and thus their legitimacy was always somewhat contested. Perhaps to compensate for this, or perhaps out of profound piety, they embarked on one of the most extraordinary architectural projects in human history. Under the most famous Zagwe king, Gebre Meskel Lalibela, a collective endeavor of staggering ambition was undertaken: the construction of a new Jerusalem in the rugged mountains of Lasta. This was not construction in the conventional sense. The builders of Lalibela did not erect structures from the ground up. They did the opposite. They descended from the top of the rock. Using hammers, chisels, and incredible patience, they carved 11 churches directly down into the solid, volcanic rock of the mountain ridge. They first trenched deep, wide moats around a huge block of stone still attached to the bedrock. Then, like sculptors revealing a form trapped within, they painstakingly hollowed out the interiors, creating naves, columns, altars, windows, and intricate reliefs, all from a single, living piece of stone. The result is a hidden, subterranean, sacred landscape. There is Bet Georgis, the Church of St. George's. George, carved in the perfect shape of a Greek cross, appearing like a colossal jewel box sunk into the earth. A complex network of tunnels, ceremonial passages, and drainage ditches connects the churches, representing the spiritual journey of a pilgrim. The motivation for this superhuman effort is deeply symbolic. With the real Jerusalem under Muslim control since the Crusades, and pilgrimage to the Holy Land nearly impossible for Ethiopian Christians, Lalibela was conceived as a spiritual compensation. It was a replication of the Holy City in the heart of Abyssinia. Features were named after their Jerusalem counterparts. The river nearby became the Jordan. A cluster of churches became the Bethlehem group. Lalibela was a monumental act of defiance and faith. It declared that the true Jerusalem was not a distant city held by infidels, but a spiritual reality that could be manifested here in the Christian highlands through sheer force of devotion and labor. It turned isolation into a virtue. We cannot go to the holy places, the Zag. We will create our own center of the world from the rock that protects us. The scale of the labor, which must have consumed the efforts of thousands for decades, also speaks to a reorientation of royal resources. No longer spent on fleets or foreign diplomacy, the kingdom's surplus energy and organizational capacity were now channeled into monumental, enduring religious art. Lalibela was a statement of power, but a power defined by piety rather than commerce or military conquest. It solidified the Christian identity of the state and provided a unifying national pilgrimage site. Yet, despite this breathtaking achievement, the Zagwe dynasty's lack of Solomonic bloodline remained a fatal flaw. Their devotion carved a New Jerusalem in rock, but it would not be enough to secure their throne forever. The legacy of Aksum, preserved not in stone but in parchment and memory, would eventually be used to supplant them. While kings built in rock and claimed descent from Solomon, the true, continuous thread linking the Aksumite past to the medieval Abyssinian present was maintained not in palaces or even in rock-hewn churches, but in the remote, austere communities of monks. As the political world contracted and became militarized, monasticism flourished in the Ethiopian highlands. From the time of the 9 saints in the Aksumite period, who are credited with deepening the roots of Christianity and establishing many of the great monastic houses, these communities became the repositories of knowledge, the guardians of language, and the historians of the nation. When the outside world faded away, the monasteries became the interior world's beating heart. Their first and most crucial role was the preservation of the ancient liturgical language, Ge'ez. As Aksum declined, the spoken language of the people gradually evolved into what we now know as Amharic, Tigrinya, and other related tongues. But Ge'ez, the language of the Aksumite kingdom, of its inscriptions and its first translations of the Bible, did not die. It was fossilized as a sacred language, much like Latin in the West or classical Arabic in the Islamic world. It became the language of liturgy, of theology, of high literature and poetry. It was in Ge'ez that the monks, laboring in scriptoria by dim light, painstakingly copied manuscripts. They did not merely copy, they illuminated. The Ethiopian manuscript tradition, with its distinctive, vibrant colors and expressive, almost abstract figurative style, is a direct artistic lineage from the Aksumite period. These manuscripts, Bibles, Psalters, Lives of Saints, theological works, were the vessels of culture. In a land without printing presses, each handmade book was a treasure, a fortress of knowledge. The monks were also the historians. They kept the royal chronicles, recording the deeds of kings, the events of battles, and the occurrences of droughts and plagues. They compiled hagiographies, the lives of the saints, which wove together spiritual instruction with historical and geographical detail. And most significantly, they were the custodians and likely the authors of the Kebra Nagast. This text, compiled in its current form in the 14th century, was the ultimate act of historical synthesis. It wove together biblical narrative, Aksumite tradition, apocryphal stories, and political ideology into a seamless, powerful epic that gave the Ethiopian state its foundational mythos, the Solomonic lineage, and the possession of the Ark. It was a work of history, theology, and political propaganda, created and preserved within the monastic milieu. The monks, in their remote communities on islands in Lake Tana, or atop nearly inaccessible mountains like Debre Damo, were not escapists. They were the active curators of the kingdom's memory and identity. They provided the intellectual and spiritual framework that allowed the state to cohere. When the Solomonic dynasty was restored in 1270, overthrowing the Zagwe, it was a restoration fueled by the ideological engine the monasteries had kept running. The new dynasty's claim was legitimized by the very texts the monks had preserved and refined. The world of medieval Abyssinia was thus a complex tapestry woven from threads of adaptation, faith, and memory. It was a kingdom that had traded its cosmopolitan ports for mountain fortresses, its gold coins for illuminated psalters, its naval hegemony for a divine covenant. It was a society that looked profoundly inward, yet cast a long, mysterious shadow outward onto the imagination of Europe. The vibrant, connected Aksum of antiquity was gone, but in its place stood something resilient, unique, and deeply rooted. The Highland fortress had become not just a refuge, but a crucible for a distinctive civilization. The silence that fell over the Red Sea trade routes was replaced by the chant of Ge'ez liturgy in rock-hewn churches and the quiet scratch of a scribe's pen in a monastery tower. The kingdom endured, not as the powerful Aksum of old, but as the legendary realm of Prester John and the devout Christian empire of Ethiopia. Its story is one of metamorphosis under pressure, proving that a civilization can sometimes survive the death of its empire by transforming its very soul. This brings us to The Silent Stelae, a detective story of decline. The Silent Stelae, Theories of Decline and Fall. They are not mere rocks, they are declarations, carved from solid granite and thrust towards the heavens by a kingdom that believed itself the equal of empires. This is Aksum, or rather, this was Aksum. A metropolis that once minted its own gold coins, that traded with Rome and Persia, that built monuments which, in their ambition, seemed to defy the very passage of time. Its name was known from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. It was a superpower of the ancient world, a Christian kingdom of profound piety and staggering wealth, rooted in the legendary lineage of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. And then, it faded. Not with a cataclysmic bang heard around the world, but with a slow, whispering sigh that left its palaces buried, its ports silted, its colossal stelae lying broken on the ground. The question hangs in the thin mountain air, as palpable as the shadow of the great obelisk. What happened to the kingdom of Aksum? This is not a story with a single simple answer. There is no Pompeii here, frozen by volcanic ash, no Carthage, raised and salted by a vengeful foe. The decline of Aksum is a deeper, more complex mystery. It is a detective story spanning centuries, a case where the culprit is not a person, but a process. The evidence is scattered across this rugged landscape, in the shards of pottery buried in anthills, in the layers of silt choking a distant coast, in the cryptic chronicles of foreign diplomats who one day simply stopped writing about this mighty kingdom. To walk through the Stelae field today is to walk through a graveyard of ambition. Each fallen monolith, some over 100 feet long, is a corpse in this unsolved crime. Who, or what, killed Aksum? We must approach this as detectives, sifting through layers of time and testimony. We have a crime scene of continental scale, from the Red Sea coast to the Tigrayan highlands. We have suspects, both human and environmental. We have a timeline that is frustratingly vague, a decline that may have begun as early as the 7th century and solidified into oblivion by the 10th. And we have a profound, lingering legacy that suggests the kingdom's spirit escaped its material collapse. This is the narrative of a civilization's unraveling. We will examine the suspects, the violent intruder, the weakened body, the mastermind who severed its lifeblood. We will visit the silent scenes of the crime, the abandoned port, the toppled towers, the overgrown foundations of power. And we will confront a tantalizing spiritual clue, the legend that at the heart of this collapse, the most sacred core of Aksumite identity, the Ark of the Covenant itself, was spirited away to safety, protecting the soul of the kingdom even as its body failed. This is the story of the Silent Stelae. Our first suspect in the mystery of Aksum's decline is the most dramatic, the most human, and in many ways the most enigmatic. She emerges from the murky history of the 10th century, like a figure from a dark myth. Her name is Gudit, or Yodit, or in some traditions, Esato, the fire. She is a queen, a rebel, a destroyer. Ethiopian chronicles and the accounts of foreign travelers like the Arab historian Ibn Hawqal tell of a ferocious, non-Christian queen who led a devastating revolt from the south. She is said to have swept down upon the Highland kingdom, burning churches, overthrowing the ancient Aksumite dynasty, and plunging the land into a dark age of chaos. She is the personification of the violent intruder, the external shock that shatters a complex system. If her story is true, then the mystery is solved. Aksum fell to a conqueror. The legend of Gudit is compelling. It speaks to a familiar historical narrative, the barbarian at the gates, the sack of Rome, the sudden end brought by sword and fire. It provides a clean, catastrophic break. The chronicles describe her as a Jew or a pagan or a worshipper of serpents, explicitly opposed to the Christian state. She is portrayed as the scourge of God, a divine punishment for a kingdom that had strayed. Her rebellion, it is said, targeted the very pillars of Aksumite power, the church and the monarchy. She is accused of destroying the great cathedral of Mariam Tion, of hunting down and killing the heirs of the Solomonic line, and of establishing a rule of terror that lasted for decades. This narrative paints a picture of a single, seismic event from which the old order could not recover. The broken Stelae, then, become not symbols of slow decay, but direct victims of her iconoclastic rage, the abandoned palaces, the shelters of a fleeing nobility. But a good detective must scrutinize the witness testimony. The accounts of Gudit are written centuries after the alleged events, often by those who sought to restore the very dynasty she supposedly destroyed. They have the flavor of political propaganda, a necessary dark age to explain a rupture in royal lineage and to legitimize the later restoration. The historical Gudit, if she existed, may have been a leader of one of the many Agar or other ethnic groups marginalized by the Aksumite elite, a figurehead for a vast social uprising rather than a foreign invader. Her invasion might have been, in truth, a revolution from within the kingdom's own sphere, a revolt of the exploited peripheries against a weakening center. The violence was likely very real. Archaeology shows evidence of burning at some church sites from this period, but its nature is ambiguous. Was it the strike of a destroyer from outside, or the explosive symptom of internal fractures already weakening the structure? The Gudit theory, while seductive, begins to look less like a lone assassin and more like a symptom of a deeper malaise. A healthy, prosperous, and unified Aksum would have been a formidable foe, capable of repelling a rebel queen. For Gudit to have been so catastrophically successful, the kingdom must have already been vulnerable. Her armies, or her revolt, may have been the spark, but the tinder must have been dry and plentiful. This leads us to ask, what conditions created such vulnerability? What had weakened the body of the Aksumite state so profoundly that it could be felled by a single, albeit powerful, blow? The violent intruder is a suspect, but perhaps not the sole perpetrator. She may have been the crisis that revealed a crisis, the final push on a structure already groaning under its own weight and crumbling from within. To understand that internal decay, we must look away from the palaces and battlefields and into the very earth upon which Aksum stood. For a kingdom does not live by prestige alone. Its might is built on grain and grass, on the sweat of farmers and the fertility of soil. Aksum was an agrarian empire, its power rooted in the plough. Its highland home was once a verdant, productive landscape, capable of supporting a dense population, a lavish court, and the immense labor required to quarry, carve, and erect 7-story tall stone obelisks. This brings us to our second suspect, a slow-acting but insidious accomplice in the crime, the environment itself. The case for ecological decline is a story of a land pushed beyond its limits, a silent crisis of erosion and exhaustion that undermined the empire from its foundation upwards. Centuries of intensive farming and animal grazing took a relentless toll. The steep slopes of the Ethiopian highlands are geologically young and fragile. When the protective cover of trees is removed, for timber to build cities, for fuel to forge iron, for charcoal to fire pottery kilns, or simply to clear new fields for a growing population, the thin topsoil becomes a prisoner of gravity. The heavy, seasonal rains, which once nourished the fields, become agents of destruction. They wash the soil down the hillsides in sheets, gullying the landscape and carrying the very wealth of Aksum into riverbeds, and, ultimately, out to sea. This is not a swift disaster, but a creeping one. A farmer might not notice it in his lifetime, only that the yields are gradually less reliable. the good soils harder to find, the rains more apt to cause damage than benefit. Archaeology provides stark evidence for this weakened body. Studies of soil cores and sediment layers tell a story of accelerating erosion precisely during the peak and decline of the Aksumite state. The very success of the kingdom contained the seeds of its ecological vulnerability. A larger population required more food, which required more land under cultivation and more trees felled. The monumental building projects consumed vast quantities of wood, for scaffolding, for rollers, for feeding the workers. The demand for iron tools and weapons meant more charcoal production. Each of these pressures, incrementally, denuded the hills. The result was a negative feedback loop. Reduced soil fertility led to lower agricultural surpluses. Those surpluses were the foundation of everything. They fed the non-farming elite, the army, the craftsmen, the priests. A shrinking surplus meant a shrinking state capacity. It meant less wealth for trade, less ability to maintain infrastructure, less resilience in the face of drought or political shock. This environmental stress would have been felt most acutely by the common people, the vast majority who worked the land. As the soil degraded and climate fluctuations, perhaps towards a drier phase, added further strain, famine would have become a more frequent and terrifying visitor. A population weakened by hunger is a population ripe for disease, discontent, and rebellion. The social contract between the Aksumite king, who claimed divine favor, and his people, who expected prosperity and protection in return for their taxes and labor, would have frayed. When the rains failed and the granaries were empty, how potent were the claims of a distant, luxurious court. The legend of Gudit, the rebel from the south, becomes more plausible when imagined against this backdrop of rural hardship. She may not have been an external invader, but a leader who channeled the deep-seated grievances of marginalized, hungry communities against a central authority that was increasingly seen as extractive and impotent. The ecological model paints a picture of a civilization consuming its own foundations. Aksum, in this light, was not murdered by an outsider, but slowly suffocated by its own success. The Stelae, those ultimate symbols of power, become ironic monuments to this process. The energy and resources required to erect them may have been a significant contributor to the very deforestation that undermined the kingdom's long-term viability. The land could not sustain such grandeur indefinitely. The weakened body hypothesis suggests that by the time our first suspect, the violent intruder, arrived on the scene, Aksum was already critically ill, economically strained, socially tense, and ecologically vulnerable. It was a body struggling to fight off an infection. But there is another suspect, one that operated on a global scale, far from the Highland fields. This suspect did not attack Aksum's body, but severed its veins. If agriculture was the kingdom's beating heart, long-distance trade was its lifeblood. From its very inception, Aksum's power was inextricably linked to its position as a commercial titan. Its port of Adulis on the Red Sea was one of the great emporiums of the ancient world. Here, the riches of the African interior, ivory, gold, rhinoceros horn, exotic animals, and enslaved people, were exchanged for the manufactured luxuries of the Roman and later Byzantine Empire, glassware, fine textiles, wine, and olive oil. More importantly, Aksum sat astride the maritime routes connecting the Mediterranean world with India and beyond. It was the essential middleman, the warehouse and protector of this lucrative traffic. The taxes and profits from this trade filled the royal coffers, allowing kings to mint their iconic gold coins, to import skilled artisans, and to project power. Trade was not an adjunct to Aksumite power, it was its very engine. Our third suspect, the mastermind of this economic strangulation, emerged in the 7th century from the deserts of Arabia, the rise of the Islamic Caliphates. This was a geopolitical earthquake that permanently redrew the map of the world. In a stunningly short period, Arab armies unified under the banner of Islam conquered the entire southern and eastern coastline of the Mediterranean, including the vital province of Egypt, and swept across the Persian Empire. For Aksum, this was a catastrophe in slow motion. First, it lost its primary trading partner and cultural ally, the Christian Byzantine Empire, which was now locked in a perpetual struggle with the Caliphates. The easy flow of goods and ideas across the Red Sea was severely disrupted by warfare and new political borders. But the more profound blow was to Aksum's role as the indispensable middleman. The unified Islamic world, stretching from Spain to Persia, now controlled both sides of the Red Sea and commanded the land routes across Arabia. Muslim merchants, operating within a vast, connected economic zone, began to redirect the Indian Ocean trade. They developed new, more efficient routes that bypassed the African Horn altogether. Ships from the Persian Gulf could now sail directly to India and China, or down the East African coast, establishing trading colonies like Kilwa and Mombasa that tapped directly into African sources of gold and ivory. The Red Sea, once the central artery of world commerce, became a backwater, a Muslim lake where a Christian Aksum was an anomaly, and eventually an irrelevance. The silting up of Adulis, often cited as a cause of decline, was likely as much a symptom as a cause. As trade dwindled, the economic incentive and the state revenue required to maintain the port's infrastructure evaporated. Dredging channels and repairing warehouses cost money that a shrinking treasury could no longer afford. The once bust-wheeling harbour slowly choked on the very sediment washed down from the eroding highlands, a fitting symbol of the kingdom's dual stranglehold. Aksum was now isolated. Its gold coins, which had circulated from Alexandria to Ceylon, ceased to be minted. The imported luxuries that defined elite status dried up. The sophisticated cosmopolitan culture that thrived on exchange began to wither. The kingdom was forced to turn inward, to rely solely on its now stressed agricultural base, without the financial cushion of international commerce. This economic death knell was silent and inexorable. There was no single battle lost, no treaty signed surrendering trade rights. It was the consequence of a larger world realigning itself, leaving Aksum on the wrong side of history. The mastermind, the Islamic Caliphate, was not actively hostile to Aksum in its later centuries. In fact, early Muslim traditions even speak kindly of the Najashi, the Aksumite king who gave shelter to the Prophet's followers. The harm was not born of malice, but of sheer geopolitical and economic gravity. Aksum was simply cut out of the loop. Its veins were severed, and the lifeblood of commerce seeped away. With a weakened body from environmental stress and a severed economic vein, the stage was set for a final, disruptive shock. To understand the full impact, we must now visit the crime scenes themselves, to read the silence they hold. The evidence of this triple assault, political, environmental, economic, is etched into the landscape. Let us first journey from the cool highlands down to the sweltering, dusty coast, to the crime scene of Adulis. Today, it is a desolate plain near the Eritrean shore, a scattering of low ruins barely distinguishable from the gravel and scrub. The sea is a distant glimmer. It requires a powerful imagination to conjure the scene here 15 centuries ago, the forest of masts in the harbour, the cacophony of languages in the market, the warehouses bursting with ivory tusks and sacks of peppercorn, the smell of salt, spices and tar. Now there is only wind and silence. Excavations reveal a town that was not suddenly destroyed, but slowly abandoned. Buildings were not razed, but simply left to crumble. The harbour silted in, and the focus of settlement crept inland, away from the receding economic promise of the sea. Adulis is a corpse that shows no signs of violence, only of a long, wasting atrophy. It is the physical manifestation of the severed vein. Now, return to the Highland capital. The Stelae field is the most iconic crime scene. The largest stela, now fallen and broken, would have been one of the tallest single stones ever erected by human hands. Its size speaks of a breathtaking confidence, an assertion of dominion over both nature and history. But today it lies in colossal fragments, a beached leviathan. The cause of its fall is debated: earthquake, deliberate toppling, or perhaps the slow undermining of its foundation by erosion and neglect. The symbolism is inescapable. These monuments, intended to proclaim eternal glory, instead mark a zenith from which the only direction was down. The silence here is not empty, it is heavy with the weight of failed ambition. The very act of erecting these stones may have contributed to the deforestation that weakened the kingdom, making them not just victims of the decline, but unwitting participants in it. Nearby, the outlines of the great palaces, like Taaka Mariam and the so-called Palace of the Queen of Sheba, are visible as low, overgrown foundations. They were multi-story marvels of stone and wood, with courtyards, audience halls, and intricate drainage systems. They speak of a complex, bureaucratic state capable of organizing sophisticated architecture. Their abandonment was gradual. Evidence suggests they were not destroyed in a conflagration, but were slowly cannibalized for building materials as the population shifted and priorities changed. The elite moved, perhaps to more defensible hilltops, and the grand symbols of central authority were left to be reclaimed by the soil they once commanded. The overgrown palace is a powerful metaphor. Nature, once subdued and harnessed, ultimately reclaiming its primacy as the human order that managed it receded. These crime scenes collectively tell a story of centrifugal collapse. The center could not hold. The economic pull of the coast vanished. The agricultural productivity of the hinterland waned. The authority of the capital fragmented. People did not vanish. They simply reoriented their lives around smaller, more local, and more sustainable units. The grand narrative of empire fractured into countless smaller stories of survival. Aksum, the political entity, dissolved, but the people, the culture, and the faith did not disappear. They adapted, retreated, and persisted in a different form. This scattering, this retreat from cosmopolitan grandeur, however, leads us to one of the most enduring and spiritual clues in the entire mystery: the fate of the kingdom's sacred heart. At the core of Aksumite identity, and indeed of Ethiopian Christian identity to this day, lies a singular, extraordinary claim that the Ark of the Covenant, the biblical chest containing the tablets of the law given to Moses, resides in Aksum. According to the national epic, the Kebra Nagast, the Ark was brought from Jerusalem by Menelik I, son of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. It became the ultimate source of divine legitimacy for the Aksumite kings, the palladium of the kingdom. Mary of Zion was built to house it, and a single, dedicated guardian was ordained to protect it for life. The Ark was not just a relic. It was the manifestation of God's covenant with Ethiopia, the proof of its status as a new Zion. So, what happened to this sacred charge during the centuries of decline? The legend provides a fascinating symbolic clue. Tradition suggests that as chaos encroached, whether from Gudit's rebellion, general instability, or the slow crumbling of order, the guardians of the Ark took their sacred charge to safety. They fled the capital, secreting the Ark away to a remote, inaccessible location, perhaps one of the many monolithic churches carved into the mountains of Tigray. There, it was protected in isolation, waiting for a time when the kingdom could be restored. This narrative is profoundly telling. It implies that the soul of Aksum, its divine covenant, was deliberately preserved even as the body politic fell apart. The material structures, the palaces, the stelae, the port, could be abandoned, but the spiritual essence was non-negotiable. It had to survive. This arc link is more than a religious footnote. It is a key to understanding the nature of Aksum's transformation. The legend underscores that the collapse was not an extinction. The faith, the Solomonic lineage, though interrupted, the core cultural identity centered on Zion, all endured. The Guardian's flight mirrors the larger societal flight from a centralized, vulnerable capital to a more dispersed, defensible, and sustainable existence in the rugged highlands. The Ark's journey to safety is the spiritual parallel of the people's adaptation. It signifies a transition from an empire of stone and trade to a kingdom of spirit and resilience. The power of Aksum, in the end, may have transmuted from the material to the ideological, from gold coins to the unbroken line of faith. The Ark was never lost to the Ethiopians. It was merely hidden, its location a secret held by a succession of guardians, connecting the ancient Aksumite glory to the medieval and modern Ethiopian state that eventually rose, claiming direct descent from it. Therefore, the mystery of Aksum's decline finds its most resonant answer, not in a single culprit, but in a tragic convergence. The violent intruder, whether Gudit or a revolutionary uprising, provided the coup de grace to a state already critically weakened. The body of the kingdom was enfeebled by centuries of ecological overreach, the slow erosion of its agricultural foundation, and its economic lifeblood was permanently cut off by the tectonic shifts of global trade following the rise of Islam. These forces, political, environmental, and economic, fed upon each other in a vicious cycle. A poorer kingdom could less afford to manage its environment or defend its periphery. A degraded environment produced less surplus to fund trade or withstand shock. Political instability further disrupted agriculture and scared away what little commerce remained. The fall of Aksum was not an event, but a process. It was the unmaking of a complex society, a return to a smaller, simpler scale of organization. The silent Stelae are not tombstones for a dead people, but milestones marking the end of one phase of civilization and the difficult transition to another. The people of the Highlands did not vanish, they changed. They traded the cosmopolitan grandeur of a world power for the resilient, faith-based identity of a mountain kingdom. They protected what they deemed essential, their covenant, their church, their sense of divine election, while letting the imperial trappings fall away. The story of Aksum's decline is, ultimately, a story of metamorphosis under extreme pressure. The empire of Adulis and the obelisks faded, but the idea of Ethiopia, the Zion of the African highlands, endured, nurtured in the scattered communities and hidden sanctuaries that kept the flame alive through the centuries of silence. This brings us to legacy in stone and spirit, the Aksum that never left. Legacy in stone and spirit, the Aksum that never left. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, a field of stone giants stands sentinel under an immense sky. These are the Stelae of Aksum, obelisks of a forgotten world, carved from single blocks of granite and erected towards the heavens. To the casual eye, they are magnificent ruins, the skeletal remains of a kingdom long turned to dust. A civilization that flourished, peaked, and then, like all empires, fell. This is the story we're accustomed to hearing, the rise and fall. It is a narrative arc as old as history itself, a comforting rhythm of birth, life, and death applied to kingdoms and cultures. We visit their remnants as archaeologists of loss, piecing together shards to guess at the whole. But what if that story is wrong? What if the most powerful truth about Aksum is not that it fell, but that it never left? This is not a tale of a dead city. Look beyond the fallen stones and the excavated foundations. Listen. The sound you hear is not the wind through ruins, but the murmur of prayer. The scent is not of ancient dust, but of incense. The figures moving among the Stelae are not just tourists, but pilgrims. For here, in this same city, life has continued in an unbroken line for 2 millennia, the Church of Saint. Mary of Zion, with its ancient chapel and its newer, grander basilica, is not a museum piece. It is a living, beating heart. And within its sanctuary, a belief so potent it defines a nation persists, that here, in a small chapel guarded by a solitary monk, rests the Ark of the Covenant. The very Ark of biblical law, the vessel of God's presence, said to have been brought to Aksum by Menelik I, son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This is not merely a legend to the faithful, it is the cornerstone of a living identity. The vigil over the Ark is perpetual, a sacred duty that has never ceased, linking the Aksum of today directly to the Aksum of the 1st century. This continuity forces us to reconsider everything. Can a civilization truly be said to have fallen when its most sacred object is still venerated, when its religious epicenter still throbs with daily devotion. Aksum challenges our deepest assumptions about history, particularly African history. For centuries, the Western narrative relegated Africa's past to a void, a dark continent waiting for the light of external contact. Great stone civilizations like Aksum were often presented as anomalies, or worse, as the work of outsiders. But Aksum was no peripheral outpost. It was a metropolis of staggering sophistication, a hub in a global network. Its coins, struck in gold, silver, and bronze, bore the faces of its kings and were currency from the Mediterranean to India. Its inscriptions were carved in 3 languages: Ge'ez, its own tongue, Greek, the lingua franca of the Eastern Roman world, and Sabaean, reflecting its deep connections across the Red Sea. It commanded a navy, traded in ivory, gold, frankincense, and live elephants, and its influence stretched from the Nile Valley to the heart of Arabia. To stand before the great stele, now lying broken, is to stand before the ambition of a people who saw themselves as central to the world. They were not wrong. Our story begins not with an ending, but with a persistence. It is a journey to discover an empire that refused to vanish, a civilization that chose transformation over extinction, and a legacy that continues to shape the spiritual and political landscape of the Horn of Africa. This is the story of the Aksum that never left. The most immediate and powerful evidence against the idea of Aksum as a dead ruin is the palpable living faith that permeates the modern town. The focus of this faith is the Church of St. Mary of Zion, a complex that is a living parchment of history itself. The oldest standing structure is a small, starkly beautiful stone chapel, dating perhaps to the 4th century, traditionally believed to have been built by King Azana himself upon his conversion to Christianity. This makes it one of the earliest Christian churches in sub-Saharan Africa. Its walls have absorbed nearly 17 centuries of prayer. But the faith did not remain confined to this ancient shell. Over the centuries, newer churches were built alongside it, each a testament to the enduring importance of the site. The grander, mid-20th century Basilica of St. Cyril, Mary of Zion, with its distinctive dome and arches, speaks to a faith that is not diminishing, but evolving and expanding. Yet, it is not the buildings themselves that are the core of the mystery. It is what they are believed to house. Within the compound, separate from both the old chapel and the new basilica, stands a small, unadorned and always locked chapel. This is the Makdas, the Holy of Holies. According to the unwavering belief of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, within this chapel rests the original Ark of the Covenant, the tablet upon which the tablets of the 10 Commandments were placed. This is not a symbolic representation. It is believed to be the very object constructed at Mount Sinai, brought to Ethiopia for safekeeping millennia ago. The story, detailed in the national epic, the Kebra Nagast, or Glory of Kings, tells of Menelik I, son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, who brought the ark from Jerusalem to Aksum. From that moment, the city was not just a political capital, it was a new Zion, the sacred resting place of God's covenant with humanity. This belief is the bedrock of Ethiopian Christian identity. Every Ethiopian Orthodox church contains a tabot, a consecrated altar slab that is a symbolic representation of the Ark, and it is the most sacred object within that church. But the original, the source of all this sanctity, is believed to be here in Aksum. The guardian of this treasure is a single monk appointed for life. He is the keeper of the Ark, and he never leaves the chapel grounds. He is the latest in an unbroken line of guardians that stretches back, tradition holds, to the Ark's arrival. His life is one of perpetual prayer and vigilance. No one else is allowed to enter the chapel, not the patriarch of the church, not the emperor in times past, not scholars or archaeologists. Its interior is a mystery to all but its keeper. This perpetual vigil is a powerful metaphor for Aksum's continuity. While empires rise and fall, while Stelae topple and palaces crumble, this one duty has never ceased. The prayer has never stopped. The belief has never wavered. It is a direct, living thread connecting the present moment to the Aksumite kingdom of the 1st centuries AD. This transforms the entire site from an archaeological park into a living sanctuary. The pilgrims who come here, often walking for days or weeks, are not coming to see a ruin. They are coming to be near the ultimate source of their faith. They prostrate themselves on the stones outside the chapel, not because they are old, but because they are holy. The air is thick with devotion, with the chant of liturgies, with the scent of candles and incense. This is not a reenactment. It is the real, ongoing practice of a faith that was born in the Aksumite era and has flourished ever since. To dismiss this as mere legend is to miss the point entirely. The power of the belief itself is a historical fact of immense consequence. It shaped Ethiopian foreign policy for centuries, fostering a sense of divine election and isolation to protect the sacred treasure. It made Aksum the spiritual capital of the nation, a role it never relinquished even after the political capital moved south. It provided a unifying identity that survived internal conflicts and external threats. The Ark is not simply a relic in a chapel, it is the ultimate symbol of unbroken sacred authority. The political and military power of the Aksumite state may have ebbed, but the spiritual authority, centered on this object and this place, was transferred seamlessly into the Christian Ethiopian state that followed. The kingdom did not disappear, its soul migrated into a new body, the body of the Church and the later Solomonic dynasty that claimed direct descent from Menelik. Therefore, to stand in the courtyard of St. Mary of Zion is to stand at the very nexus of this transformation. You are surrounded by physical evidence of different eras, the 4th century chapel, the 17th century walls, the 20th century basilica, all orbiting the timeless, inaccessible heart of the chapel. It is a tangible lesson in continuity. The stones may speak of different centuries, but the prayer is the same, the faith is the same. The Ark, whether historical object or profound symbol, represents an unbroken covenant between this place and its people. Aksum, in this most vital sense, never fell silent. Its hymn is still being sung. This continuity is echoed powerfully in another realm, that of language and ritual. Just as the vigil at the Ark has never ceased, the ancient tongue of the Aksumites has never died. That language is Ge'ez. Today, Ge'ez is a classical language, akin to Latin in the West or classical Arabic in the Islamic world. It is no longer a spoken language of the street, of the market, or the home, but it is very far from dead. It is the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. Every liturgy, every hymn, every scripture reading, every intricate theological treatise of the Church is in Ge'ez. This means that for millions of faithful every week, the sounds that filled the Aksumite royal court and the early Christian churches of the 4th century still fill the air. The very syllables uttered by King Izana on his conversion inscriptions are the syllables used in prayer today. This is not a reconstruction. It is a direct, unmediated transmission. The priests and scholars who study Ge'ez are not simply archaeologists of language, they are curators of a living flame. They learn its grammar, its script, its vocabulary to access the sacred texts and perpetuate the worship. In doing so, they become living bridges to the Aksumite world. The script itself, a unique and elegant abugida, evolved from the earlier Sabaean script used in Aksumite inscriptions. When a deacon chants from the Bible in Ge'ez, he is using a linguistic technology perfected in the heyday of the empire. The language of state has become the language of spirit, another seamless transfer of authority from the political to the religious sphere. This unbroken thread was pulled taut in a spectacular modern ceremony that explicitly wove together the ancient and the contemporary, the coronation of Emperor Haile Selassie I in 1930. The location was not the then capital, Addis Ababa, but Aksum. The choice was profoundly symbolic. Haile Selassie, whose regnal name meant Power of the Trinity, was claiming direct descent from the Solomonic line, from Menelik I, son of Solomon and Sheba. By being crowned in Aksum, he was grounding his legitimacy in the deepest possible soil. The ceremony was a conscious reenactment and reaffirmation of the ancient covenant. It took place in the old church of St. C. Mary of Zion, the very heart of the Aksumite spiritual legacy. The rituals, the hymns, the language, all was steeped in tradition that reached back to Azana and beyond. Foreign dignitaries and journalists looked on as a ceremony of breathtaking antiquity unfolded. Haile Selassie was not just becoming a modern constitutional monarch, he was being anointed as a king in the line of the Aksumite Negusa Nagast, the King of Kings. He was, in the eyes of the church and the tradition, the latest guardian of the Ark's legacy, the protector of the faith that defined the empire. The coronation was a potent statement to the world. At a time when Africa was largely under colonial domination, here was a sovereign African nation with its own ancient written history, its own indigenous Christian tradition, and its own unbroken line of authority, crowning its emperor in a city that was old when Rome was young. It was a defiant assertion of continuity and independence. The rituals performed that day were not invented for the occasion. They were drawn from the deep well of Ge'ez liturgy and Aksumite, derived royal custom. The vestments, the crowns, the protocols, all spoke of a kingdom that had never been extinguished, only transformed. This event demonstrates how the legacy of Aksum was not locked in the past, but was a usable, powerful tool for defining modern Ethiopian identity. The political power may have migrated south over the centuries, first to Lalibela, then to Gondar, then to Addis Ababa, but the spiritual and symbolic power always circled back to Aksum. It remained the sacred source, the font of legitimacy. Every emperor before Haile Selassie who claimed Solomonic descent understood this. Aksum was the wellspring. To be crowned, there was to drink directly from that well, to be infused with its historical and spiritual authority. Thus, the living Ge'ez liturgy and the 1930 coronation are two sides of the same coin. One is the daily, humble continuity of sound and meaning, the steady drumbeat of tradition in countless churches. The other was a singular, spectacular performance of that continuity on a world stage. Together, they shatter the illusion of a clean break between ancient Aksum and modern Ethiopia. There was no break. There was an evolution, a migration, a transformation, but the core identity rooted in a Semitic language, a Judaic Christian faith, and a Solomonic royal ideology remained intact. The language of the Aksumite stone inscriptions is the language of the church service. The city where those inscriptions were carved is the city where a 20th century emperor was crowned. The thread is not just unbroken, it is visibly, audibly, powerfully present. It tells us that civilizations do not always die in cataclysms. Sometimes they translate themselves. They take their most essential elements, their sacred words, their foundational rituals, and they carry them forward, embedding them in new institutions, new political forms. The body of the Aksumite state may have changed, but its voice, its soul, its claim to sacred authority never faltered. It found new vessels, and in doing so, achieved a kind of immortality. This brings us to a fundamental rethinking of the very idea of Aksum's fall. Western historiography, shaped by the dramatic collapses of Rome or the Maya, often seeks a clear narrative of decline and fall, an invasion, an economic collapse, an environmental catastrophe. For Aksum, such a clear, catastrophic endpoint is elusive. The kingdom did not vanish overnight, its power did not evaporate. Instead, the evidence points to a long, complex process of transformation. Aksum did not fall in a classical sense. Its political and economic center of gravity shifted, its religion evolved from a polytheistic to a monotheistic framework, and its civilization never broke. It bent, it adapted, and it persisted in a new form. The story is not one of death, but of metamorphosis. Several factors contributed to this gradual change. The rise of the Islamic Caliphate in the 7th century dramatically altered the geopolitical and economic landscape of the Red Sea. Aksum, which had been a dominant player in the trade between the Mediterranean and India, found its maritime routes challenged. However, it did not collapse. It turned inward, consolidating its power on the Ethiopian plateau. Trade continued, but its nature and routes adapted. The kingdom's focus shifted from international maritime commerce to agrarian expansion, and deeper integration with the African interior. Crucially, the core institution of the monarchy and the state ideology underwent a profound evolution that ensured continuity. The conversion to Christianity in the 4th century under King Ezana was not the end of Aksumite civilization, it was its rebirth under a new divine mandate. The old gods, like Marem, were replaced by the Christian god, but the concept of the king as divinely chosen, as a mediator between heaven and earth, remained, and was even strengthened. The Christian king was still the Negusa Nagast, ruling by the grace of God. The monumental stelae, perhaps originally pagan funerary markers, gave way to another form of monumental architecture, rock-hewn churches. This shift represents not a loss of technical skill or ambition, but a redirecting of that ambition towards a new spiritual purpose. The energy that once raised 100-ton obelisks was later channeled into carving entire churches from living rock at Lalibela, a direct architectural and spiritual successor to Aksumite tradition. The political capital may have moved from Aksum to other centers for strategic reasons: environmental stress, shifting trade patterns, the need for more defensible locations. But each new center carried the Aksumite template with it: the Ge'ez language, the Christian faith, the Solomonic ideology, and the administrative practices. This is where the Ark of the Covenant becomes the ultimate symbol of this unbroken transfer of authority. Whether viewed as physical object or powerful national myth, the Ark represents the concept of a portable, indestructible source of legitimacy. In the biblical narrative, the Ark preceded the temple. It traveled with the Israelites. It was the focal point of God's presence. In the Ethiopian narrative, the Ark's journey to Aksum sanctified the city as a new Zion. When the political power of Aksum waned, the Ark did not lose its power. Its perceived presence ensured that Aksum remained the spiritual capital, the sine qua non of legitimacy. Any later dynasty that sought to rule a Christian Ethiopia had to connect itself to Aksum and the Ark's legacy. The so-called Solomonic Restoration in the 13th century, which established a line of kings claiming direct descent from Solomon and Sheba, was fundamentally a reassertion of this Aksumite-derived covenant. They didn't revive a dead tradition. They re-energized a living one that had never disappeared, only decentralized. Therefore, the fall of Aksum is better understood as a strategic retreat and a spiritual consolidation. The empire's political power migrated south and inland. Its religion evolved from a mix of indigenous and South Arabian gods to Christianity, but its civilization, its core identity never broke. It transformed, like a river changing course, but the water, the essential substance, remained the same. The Ark symbolizes this perfectly, a sacred, central authority that can be moved, guarded, and preserved, ensuring that the covenant and the civilization built upon it endures through all earthly changes. For centuries, the true scale and sophistication of the Aksumite kingdom was shrouded in mystery, known primarily from its visible stelae, a few ruined palaces, and tantalizing references in Greek, Roman, and Arabic texts. The narrative, even when acknowledging its greatness, often framed it as an isolated marvel. Modern archaeology is now radically rewriting this story, revealing an empire of staggering scale, complexity, and interconnectedness. This scientific rediscovery is providing a material foundation for the living cultural legacy, proving that the traditions and the sense of grandeur were not fantasies, but memories of a tangible reality. Recent discoveries are painting a picture of a vast urbanized landscape, a state with profound administrative reach, and a civilization fully engaged with the classical and early medieval worlds. Perhaps no single discovery has been as revolutionary in this regard as the site of Beit Samati. Beit Samati, meaning House of Audience, in the local Tigrinya language, is a site located between Aksum and the Red Sea. Excavations that began in the last decade have uncovered something extraordinary, a massive, 50-meter-long rectangular building that was clearly a public administrative and religious center. The structure dates from the 4th century BCE to the 7th century CE, spanning the entire pre-Aksumite and Aksumite periods. Within it, archaeologists found a trove of objects that speak of wealth, trade, and multicultural connections: intricate gold jewelry, Roman-era glass vessels, large quantities of pottery from the Mediterranean and South Arabia, and a huge quantity of clay bullae. Sealings used to stamp documents or secure goods. These bullae are the bureaucratic fingerprints of a complex state. They indicate record-keeping, taxation, controlled trade, and a hierarchical administration that could project its authority over a significant distance. The building itself, with its basilica-style layout, is also a critical piece of evidence for the early history of Christianity in the region, potentially showing the adaptation of Roman architectural forms for Christian worship in Aksumite territory. The significance of Beta Samati cannot be overstated. It proves that the Aksumite kingdom was not just a single glorious city, but a territorial empire with administrative hubs controlling its hinterlands and trade routes. It shows a level of bureaucratic complexity on par with contemporary empires. The range of imported goods confirms the textual accounts of Aksum's role as a global trading hub. But perhaps most importantly, it physically demonstrates the transition from the pre-Christian to the Christian era within a single, continuous site. The layers of history are not separate, they are integrated, showing evolution, not rupture. This discovery, and others like it using technologies like LiDAR and satellite imagery, are revealing a network of towns, roads, and farmsteads that sustained the capital. They show an empire that managed its environment through sophisticated terrace farming and water management. Each new find adds another brushstroke to the portrait of a centralized, innovative, and powerful state. This archaeological revolution is doing more than just filling in gaps in Aksum's history. It is actively dismantling pernicious colonial-era narratives about African history. For too long, the default assumption was that complex urbanization, literacy, state bureaucracy, and long-distance trade were imports to Africa, brought by outsiders. Aksum, sitting proudly in the interior of the continent, completely upends this view. Here was an indigenous African civilization that developed its own writing system, minted its own coinage, erected monumental architecture, and built a bureaucratic state, all without European or Middle Eastern colonization. It did so through a unique synthesis of indigenous African cultures and influences from across the Red Sea, but the synthesis was its own. The discovery of sites like Beta Samati provides the irrefutable material evidence. It rewrites African history from a narrative of absence to one of presence, from a story of isolation to one of central engagement. It proves that the Horn of Africa was not a passive recipient of culture, but a generative crucible of its own. The living legacy of Aksum, the church, the Ark, the Gies language, always held this truth intuitively. Now, archaeology is providing the proof. It is confirming that the memories carried in ritual and legend are echoes of a real, formidable, and sophisticated empire. The stones are finally speaking with a clear voice, and they are telling a story of African agency, achievement, and enduring influence on a global stage. As we piece together the evidence, from the living faith at St. Mary of Zion to the unbroken chant of Gies, from the symbolic coronation of Haile Selassie to the transformative nature of its decline, and now from the groundbreaking revelations of archaeology, a final, overarching reflection comes into focus. The legacy of Aksum is more than a historical curiosity. It is a profound challenge. It is a challenge to the single-story narrative of history itself, particularly the history of Africa. For centuries, the global historical canon has been skewed, telling a story where civilization, complexity, and progress moved along a predictable axis from east to west, from Mesopotamia to Greece to Rome to Europe. Africa, in this telling, was largely a blank space, a continent of tribes and kingdoms waiting for external contact to catalyze development. Aksum demolishes this simplistic, Eurocentric timeline. Here, in the highlands of Ethiopia, a contemporary of the Roman Empire, a peer of Persia and Han China, flourished as an African superpower. It was not on the periphery, it was a central node in the ancient world's network. Its merchants knew the markets of Alexandria and India. Its diplomats treated with the Roman emperors. Its theologians debated Christology with the patriarchs of Constantinople and Alexandria. It was, unequivocally, a part of the global conversation of its age. This matters deeply because history is not just about the past, it is about identity and possibility in the present. To acknowledge Aksum as the African superpower it was is to restore a chapter of monumental importance to the world's story. It affirms that the capacity for complex statecraft, monumental engineering, literary culture, and global economic integration is not the patrimony of one continent or one people. It is a human potential, realized in diverse forms across the globe. Aksum's legacy insists that Africa's past is not one of absence, but of powerful, influential presence. Its innovations, from a unique script to a distinctive form of Christianity that incorporated Judaic elements, contributed to the tapestry of human culture in ways we are still unraveling. The very concept of a Christian kingdom in Africa, enduring for 1700 years, shaped the religious map of the world and provided a counterpoint to the spread of Islam in the region, leading to a unique coexistence. But perhaps the most poignant challenge Aksum presents is to our definition of endurance. We are conditioned to equate the endurance of a civilization with the continuous political dominance of its original capital. By that narrow measure, many great civilizations have fallen. But Aksum proposes a different model of survival, the survival of the spirit, the identity, the core covenant. Its political power migrated, but its soul found a permanent home in the church and in the national consciousness. Its greatest monument is not the tallest stele, but the unbroken line of a liturgy. Its ultimate treasure is not a hoard of gold, but a belief that has anchored a people for millennia. This is a powerful and humbling lesson. It suggests that the true strength of a culture may lie not in the imperviousness of its stones, but in the adaptability and resilience of its ideas and faith. To walk the sacred fields of Aksum today is to feel this duality. Underfoot are the tangible remains of worldly power, the foundations of immense palaces, the trenches of wealthy tombs, the fallen giants of the Stelae field. They speak of ambition, wealth, and temporal authority that was indeed, in time, eclipsed. But in the air is something else, the spirit of the place. It is in the devotion of the pilgrim touching the wall of the old chapel. It is in the scholar tracing Guy's letters in a manuscript. It is in the farmer tending his plot on terraces first built by Aksumite engineers. This spirit never left. It transformed, it persisted, it endured. Aksum's legacy, therefore, is a living dialogue between stone and spirit. The stones testify to what was built. The spirit testifies to what was never lost. Together, they tell the story not of an empire that died, but of a civilization that made a choice to translate its earthly kingdom into a heavenly one, and in doing so, to achieve a form of eternity. Its kings may have passed into the chronicles, but its heartbeat still echoes in the liturgy. Its gaze still rests upon the ark, and its memory continues to shape the identity of a nation. This is the Aksum that never left. It is a kingdom that resides not just in the ground, but in the soul. This brings us to